cursed by your name in my mind. I'm disturbed.
It's October 28th in Canton, Ohio. Halloween is 3 days away, and 29-year-old Morgan Fox is doing it all. She's balancing her dreams of a promising career and cultivating a happy family with her loving boyfriend, Jason, and their young daughters.
I can't get you out, no.
But early one morning, when he looks out the window, Jason sees something alarming and dials 911.
Morgan was getting in her vehicle, getting ready to leave for work. She's usually gone by 2:15 a.m., and she was taken by surprise. She was shot. She died immediately. My name's Rocco Ross. I was the lead investigator for the Morgan Ashley Fox case. When I arrived there were several other people standing around. Aside from law enforcement, there was a reporter standing there. Walking towards the residence, you can see there's a white vinyl fence that had mud flung along the fence. Right next to that, there were tire tracks in the mud, in the grass, right off of the roadway. They approached the vehicle in the driveway. I saw Morgan Fox sitting in her vehicle. I saw her slumped over the center console with blood on the side of her head and running down her shirt.
Her belongings lie abandoned on the damp ground beside her cracked cell phone. Someone walked up to Morgan and shot her multiple times, killing her instantly.
Morgan Fox's mom arrives, and she said that she received the call from an employee of the shipping company that Morgan works for. Called her and said, "Hey, Morgan did not come to work last night. Just checking in to see if she's okay." And while I'm speaking with her, the reporter blurts out that she was shot in the head. So that's how Morgan Fox's mom found out what had happened to her daughter.
And the news of her murder hits her family hard.
Cora Stonerock, Mark.
My name is Cora Stonerock, and I am Morgan's stepsister. The day she died, I was trying to get the kids out the door. My sister screams my name. She was ghost white, and she said, "Morgan's dead." I remember screaming at her. She's trying to tell me that Morgan's dead, but I don't know how. It doesn't seem possible.
It's hard to believe anyone would want to hurt Morgan. Clever, smart, and friendly, she was loved by everyone. She's part of a modern-day Brady Bunch family.
My dad and Cindy, Morgan's mom, met when I was in the 2nd grade. We were a family of 7, and Cindy's family was 5, so together there was 12 of us. Me and Morgan were best friends from the get. She definitely was somebody that knew what she wanted in life.
Morgan knows exactly what she wants, when she wants it. But as soon as she turns 20, life comes fast, and she becomes a mom.
She was super excited to be a mother. She was thrilled. She longed for this.
But things don't work out between Morgan and her daughter's father. So Morgan moves to Canton for a new start, where she lands a promising career and a seemingly perfect boyfriend, Jason Scarnecchia.
She could not wait to be married, for her dream house, for her dream job, for a family. And that's why she chose FedEx, as she wanted to be able to move up. She wanted something where she would make enough money to be able to give her daughter, Amelia, the life that she always wanted to give Amelia. Morgan ended up getting promoted and ended up moving up to be team manager. So that was a goal of hers, and she accomplished it.
But now, Morgan's dreams have been cut short, and detectives need to know why. They inspect the scene for clues.
My name is Dennis Barr, and I am the Chief Criminal Prosecutor for Stark County, Ohio.
Dennis Barr, Marker.
We found in her console there was some money. Her purse was laying on the ground. This is not a robbery going bad. Somebody, for some reason, came here with the specific intention of killing Morgan Fox.
Police check the neighborhood for witnesses, but they come up empty-handed.
There was a few people that had Ring doorbell cameras, but didn't capture anything. We had no weapon on the scene.
And not one person heard a peep, gunshot, or even a scream, including Morgan's boyfriend, Jason. Jason was the first person to find Morgan, and for a grieving boyfriend, he's oddly calm.
Jason Scarnecchia is the one that called 911.
911, do you need police, fire, or medical help?
Medical. I mean, I'm pretty sure my girlfriend's fucking dead.
My first contact with him, he appeared to be a little bit in shock. I asked for his cell phones, and he handed over his personal one. He was more hesitant to hand over his work cell and said it wasn't his.
If Jason has nothing to hide, why is he so hesitant?
Once we told him that he would probably get it back at some point, he handed it over. We told him, you're going to go to the sheriff's office for some questioning. We need to talk to you a little further. He was barefoot at that point, so I asked him where his socks were kept. I'll go get them for you.
This is now a crime scene. We can't just let people wander around it. One of the things they could do is maybe hide evidence or destroy evidence.
He chose to go without the socks. It was very odd. Once Jason Scarnecchia got to the sheriff's office, he was interviewed there.
But Jason's subdued demeanor continues.
Not what I would expect for someone who just woke up and found the woman that they love dead in the front seat of her car.
Jason says the night before, Morgan dropped her daughter off at her mom's house, then came home around 9:30 p.m. and went to bed. Early the next morning, at 1:30 a.m., Morgan got up to go to work. Only she never made it out of the driveway alive. Jason heard nothing and saw nothing until he found Morgan's body.
He did admit that they had some arguments and fights, but they were fine at that moment.
But text messages found on Jason's phone paint a different picture.
It appeared that Morgan Fox and Jason Scarnecchia had some fights prior to this incident, and it turned violent.
Is it possible that a couple's quarrel pushed her boyfriend Jason over the edge? The detectives begin to realize this is just the start to a disturbing new twist. Morgan Fox was building the life and career she always wanted. But when she's found dead in her driveway, the detectives zero in on her boyfriend Jason Scarnecchia for answers. And his strange behavior makes him look extremely suspicious.
Well, you always start off with their significant other. Any reason, any motive that might give them a reason to commit this crime.
Was this just a typical lover's quarrel? Or was Morgan in a toxic relationship destined to end in tragedy?
Morgan met Jason Scarnecchia at FedEx. He was very kind to her, and he also had a daughter. And then they realized that if they wanted to take things to the next level, one of them were going to have to move jobs. So that's when Jason chose to leave FedEx so that him and Morgan could continue to be together.
Is it possible that Morgan's boyfriend, Jason Scarnecchia, isn't the nice guy he appears to be? After 2 hours of intense questioning, he bursts into tears.
It finally hit him that his girlfriend was just murdered.
Is this the clever act of a murderer? Could these tears actually be tears of guilt? Other than evidence of one intense fight, there's no reason to hold Jason. So he's free to go, for now. But questions remain. Why didn't Jason hear those fatal gunshots just a few feet outside his bedroom window? Where is the murder weapon? So detectives shift their gaze into Morgan and Jason's home.
In searching their residence, it did not appear that there was any struggle inside.
And once they get to the bedroom, detectives find what Jason was trying to hide from them earlier that morning.
We found a little bit of marijuana in his sock drawer. He was worried about the drugs, and here his girlfriend was just murdered.
Could a simple bag of marijuana be the cause of Jason's anxiety? Or was there another factor at play? With no evidence of foul play and no murder weapon accounted for, Morgan's boyfriend Jason is not in the clear just yet.
You focus first on the spouse, and then you've got to focus on who does she know? Who are her acquaintances? That morning, Morgan's mother told the deputies, look, she had a problem with some people at FedEx where she worked. Something about her phone, which led us to FedEx.
My name is Michelle Hannes. I worked at FedEx Ground in North Canton. My position was Operations Administrator HR. The police had asked me about Jason Scarnecchia. When I first started as a package handler, he was my manager. He was very encouraging. So I liked him.
But could he have killed Morgan?
I had expressed that to the police, that there was no way he would have done that. I felt that there may have been one of the other managers or one of the other employees that were retaliating against Morgan.
Retaliate? What could she have possibly done to warrant retaliation from a coworker?
I learned that one of the coworkers, he had a crush on Morgan prior to her getting with Jason Scarnecchia.
She really was drawn to Jason and ended up being with Jason, and I think that a lot of people's feelings were upset, and that's when a lot of the problems occurred.
But that's not the only drama swirling around the office. When Morgan gets the promotion to manager she's been gunning for, many of her male colleagues become jealous.
There weren't a lot of women who went into management positions. It felt like a boys' club.
The jealousy or intimidation with Morgan's attire, what she wore to work, they didn't like how she dressed. So they complained about that.
She was feeling like she was being bullied or harassed by other managers, and it bothered me.
Then, the investigators learned these same two managers and one of Morgan's friends were involved in the cell phone incident that Morgan's mom had warned them about.
I saw her crying. She said, I need to talk to you.
She had set her phone down to help another employee get her line caught up, and then they had just taken her phone.
Morgan's phone was unlocked, and these two managers just started scrolling.
Morgan was active on, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. She posted more than like the average person for sure. She used social media a lot.
Like, I saw the managers talking about her and looking at her social media, and I knew, like, that's totally inappropriate.
But there are some photos that coworkers aren't meant to see. Ones that Morgan had taken for her boyfriend's eyes only.
She radioed, hey, has anybody seen my phone? Another person told her that Jason McDermott had it in the sort tower, an elevated area where the boxes are being moved on the conveyor belts. Morgan was friends with Jason McDermott, who was a package handler at the time. She went up there to confront him about, getting her phone back.
He lied to her at first and told her that he did not have the phone. And then she saw the phone and he ended up handing it to her.
Morgan wasn't shocked the other two guys went through her phone, but she would have never expected this from her friend, Jason McDermott.
I can't feel a thing, but tears on my cheek.
She was upset and didn't want anything to do with him.
After her phone was stolen, she had said, I don't think we should be friends, friends don't lie to each other.
Morgan reports the incident with 3 of her coworkers to a manager who promises to take care of it. But after 10 days, she hears nothing but silence. When Morgan asks her manager for an update, she gets reprimanded instead.
The result of Morgan asking, hey, what's gonna happen about this person who took my phone? Instead, gets handed a dress code violation. You're wearing leggings, you shouldn't be wearing leggings.
Morgan Fox filed a complaint against some of her coworkers for harassing her for this attire. Morgan thought that by filing this complaint, she thought HR would have handled that with them.
Then, the harassment starts to escalate.
Somebody took her chair and her clipboard one day. 2 of the managers were like talking behind her back and like gossiping. She told me that she had heard comments and that it was inappropriate, you know, like sexual comments. Morgan felt targeted.
13 days after Morgan's phone was taken, and 1 week before she's murdered, Morgan's patience runs out.
Like, you could see her more withdrawn than usual, where Morgan usually was very spunky and happy.
Morgan is done sitting on the sidelines, furious, and supported by Michelle, she takes action.
My solution to, you know, our conversation was, why don't I reach out to HR, the head of HR in Columbus, and see if maybe she can do something. This is an excerpt from the email that I sent to HR. Morgan Fox asked to speak with me yesterday about some issues she is having as an ops manager. Apparently someone took her phone. She believes private items were looked at by at least 2 to 3 people in the building. It felt better, like, okay, great. This, you know, some of these issues have been put on paper, like they're known. Now they're known. This is what's going on, and maybe there will be some kind of resolution for Morgan. But there was no response to the email.
Another week goes by, and she has still heard nothing. Morgan has had it.
That was her final straw. She wanted something done about this. Like they were just harassing her so much that she wanted it addressed.
The tension was boiling over. She stood up for herself. She stood up for the things that were going on at the workplace that were hostile. On October 28th, as soon as I went in to work, I looked for Morgan because I had anticipated that we would have a conversation. I texted her. She never answered. Police had called and told me that Morgan had passed. I was completely shocked, horrified, and confused. All these people at work were bothering her. And I thought, did one of those people hurt her?
The investigators need to talk to all of the men involved with the incident. So they start with Morgan's friend, Jason McDermott. Maybe he can shed some light on why Morgan was being targeted at work.
All right, Jason, has anybody been fucking with her at work?
Yeah.
The coworker crushes, swirling jealousy, and workplace bullying. Could Jason McDermott hold the key to solving the mystery of who killed Morgan Fox? Morgan Fox was pushing her way through the glass ceiling at FedEx as a manager, possibly making a few enemies along the way. A pattern of jealousy, betrayal, and harassment from a small group of male coworkers is uncovered. But what detectives want to know from Morgan's friend Jason McDermott is, could one of these workplace bullies be a murderer?
All right, Jason, you're coming out here to try and help us, give us some information. Do you guys hang out outside of work at all?
Yes. Not often, but yes. Basically, when one of us was having like a bad day, apparently we were the person that we would go to and like vent about that type of stuff.
Okay.
Like, and
do you ever tell you anything or confide in you in personal stuff at home?
Yeah.
Between her and Jason?
Yes. They were having a lot of issues lately.
Do you ever say anything ever physical between them?
Often I would see her post like something on her Snapchat where it's like you could tell something was wrong.
McDermott's statements seem to point back at their first suspect, Morgan's boyfriend, Jason Scarnecchia. But then, McDermott says something that catches them off guard.
Who can you guarantee me didn't have anything to do with shooting her?
Jason. Jason can be many things, but he's not that kind of person. Like, he legitimately cared for Morgan.
If McDermott doesn't think Morgan's boyfriend is capable of murder, perhaps he knows who is.
Has anybody been fucking with her at work?
Yeah.
Okay, who?
She's been having issues on the morning shift with a lot of people. The manager who's below Dan but above the rest. But he would deliberately go out of his way to cause issues for her at work. He yelled at her all the time.
The investigators want to know more about the cell phone incident with her male colleagues a few weeks back. An incident McDermott is intimately familiar with.
She had misplaced her phone somewhere, couldn't find it, and she asked me if I could help her locate it. One of the QAs, he had the phone in his possession. He handed me the phone. I saw her shit was open. I regrettably looked through a few of her files. She said, yeah, I saw one where she was in her brown underwear, and I was like, as soon as I saw that, I clicked out of it because like that wasn't our relationship. She's upset with me, as she should be.
It's no secret that Morgan had issues with her coworkers after being violated like that. But would anyone go to the extreme to murder her over it after she went to HR? McDermott doesn't have a clue, so he's free to go. And his instincts about Morgan's boyfriend were right. The absence of gunpowder residue in their home and on his body clear any suspicion of Jason Scarnecchia. He couldn't have been the person to fire the gun.
I never really thought it was Jason Scarnecchia. Like, it wasn't his character.
So Morgan's boyfriend joins the rest of her family as they continue to grapple with this senseless tragedy.
Watching my family, especially Cindy, Morgan's mom, lose a child, and her daughter, Amelia, to lose a mother, her only parent, you can't really describe the trauma, the heartbreak, the feelings. I just have to trust that the detectives and the police are going to do their job.
But when something so heinous happens in your own family, your own community, no one can be prepared for that kind of shock.
This was probably one of the most emotional cases just because the senselessness of the killing. You have an innocent victim who hasn't done anything, and a girl who lost her mom, and they were the two closest people in the world. You've got a family that's lost a loved one, and they want to see some justice done. Bringing them justice falls on me.
But first, detectives have to find Morgan's killer. And nearly 10 hours after her body was found in her driveway, detectives get a lucky break. An anonymous tip about one of Morgan's bosses sends the investigators racing back to FedEx for another interview.
Morgan Fox may have been having an affair with one of the higher-ups at the company. Very suspicious.
Could the tension and jealousy surrounding a hidden romance in the workplace be the reason for Morgan's tragic end? With no time to waste, the detectives are on the hunt for their next big lead.
We went to this person's residence. We spoke to his wife, ex-wife, and they were just recently divorced. And she told us where we could find him. So that's where we went to get a hold of him and bring him in for an interview. He was hesitant, didn't want to come in, but he did.
Salacious tales of a workplace affair and a new person of interest. Someone at FedEx could be Morgan's killer.
There was a lot of talk, a lot of rumors going back and forth.
Could this anonymous caller be onto something that no one saw coming? stories about tense workplace harassment have sent investigators looking into a tip about a possible affair. Is it possible this had something to do with her murder?
He gave consent at first to look through his phone. It was his work phone. There were so many blocks. We couldn't really see anything in it.
Morgan's boss denies the affair. Is he hiding something? The answers could be in his locked phone.
When we told him we're just gonna have to keep this for further analysis, he was not happy at all.
A few hours later, the lab analysis of his phone comes back and it's clear. This is not their guy.
They got their kids together for a little get-together, but that's the extent of the relationship that we found.
There was a lot of talk, a lot of rumors going back and forth. You know how gossip goes around with people.
Is this anonymous tip just another instance of Morgan's colleagues taunting her, even after her death? Or is it a killer's attempt to throw the detectives off their trail? Detectives go back to Morgan's toxic work situation and the cell phone incident that might have started it all.
We got the phones of most of the men she was having issues with.
Those people were quickly ruled out based upon things we found in Morgan's phone, things we found in their phone when they let us look at it. One guy had an alibi, but the one person we couldn't rule out was Jason McDermott.
In order to unravel the truth about what was really going on at FedEx, investigators call in some help.
I'm Brian Johnson. I work for the Stark County Sheriff's Office. I'm a sergeant detective, and I assisted with investigating Morgan's murder. We ultimately had to get a search warrant for FedEx and obtain personnel files, and I was able to obtain security videos inside of their warehouse, particularly for the incident that occurred on October 8th. Jason McDermott took Morgan Fox's phone off of a desk for 50 minutes. He was looking at her phone. There was nothing done from that incident on October 8th.
According to Jason, he simply retrieved the phone, like any good friend would do. But according to the video, he spent way more time swiping through it. Now that the detectives know McDermott lied about the phone incident, they start to take a closer look at how he acted in the workplace.
Jason McDermott's coworkers told us that after that October 8th incident, he talked to several of them about how can I get Morgan back into my life.
Then, Jason's file reveals that this mild-mannered friend is more dangerous than anyone could have thought.
Jason McDermott's personnel file, unknown to us, had not only the incident with Morgan Fox on October 8th, but it also had an incident from that same year, from June 6th.
Sienna Clements interview, take one.
My name is Sienna Clements. I started FedEx back in 2019. I was 18 years old. When I first met Jason McDermott, he threw me up into the SOAR tower, so he was actually training me at the time.
After a few months, Sienna felt comfortable enough to ask Jason for some help.
Back in 2019 of September, I lost my license due to a traffic infraction. I started getting rides from Jason McDermott.
A few months later, one of Sienna's other friends gets a job at FedEx too, so she stops getting rides with Jason. That's when things get weird.
Jason McDermott would get on my social media and just start commenting on everything, inboxing me, whether it's my TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook. He wanted to know what I was doing at all times. He started being very persistent. He would text, if I didn't answer, text again, over and over and over and over again. You knew he was creepy, but you didn't know he was that creepy. I didn't want to be around him no more. I didn't want to have contact with him no more. Leave me alone.
One day, during Sienna's counseling session, Jason McDermott took things to a terrifying new level.
I was at my court counselor, just got a ride from my friend, got dropped off.
The session starts, and Sienna catches a glimpse of a familiar and frightening sight.
You see that blue little car right in front of the door. And then he sits out there.
Like Morgan would do months later, Sienna files a complaint.
I remember going to my managers at FedEx for the reasoning of feeling harassed and just overwhelmed with the situation because I got to the point I had no idea what to do.
And like Morgan, she received a similar response.
At the end of the day, nothing got handled. About a month later, the manager, he pulled me into the office and let me go.
Sienna's tale of being stalked by Jason is scary. But there's no evidence that he was doing the same to Morgan. So the detectives keep digging, as Morgan's family and coworkers keep reeling with shock.
Morgan's sister-in-law made a flyer, and it just said, like, please help bring justice to Morgan. I remember going through my Facebook and seeing who was posting. Other people that were at FedEx weren't posting, but Jason McDermott's been there 3 times now, changing his profile picture, making these big, long posts. Something for me was not right.
With concerns mounting from Morgan's family, Ross speaks to Jason's parents to see if he can connect him to the scene of Morgan's murder.
The dad I talked to first, he said it had been months since Jason McDermott had been home. But Mom said, oh no, he stopped the other day to pick up some mail. And that's the last time I really saw him until the morning of the murder.
On a hunch, Detective Ross asks if there are any firearms in the house.
McDermott's dad took us to his gun locker. It was locked, but the key was 6 feet away in a drawer at the workbench.
Jason McDermott's father allowed us to take several of his handguns that we believed were similar calibers to the one that killed Morgan Fox. We were able to send those to the crime lab for analysis.
And when the results come back, one gun from the McDermott's residence is a potential match to the same gun used to kill Morgan.
And now it's becoming clearer to us that this is our guy. We just got to get enough evidence to prove it.
Digging deeper, Ross scrutinizes McDermott's interview from October 28th and uncovers a curious omission.
The day of Morgan Fox's homicide, when I made contact with McDermott, we noticed his car was clean. He told us that he just ran through the car wash on the way to his parents' house that morning.
But when the other detective spoke to him at the sheriff's station, McDermott switched things up.
When asked, where did you go from work, McDermott left that information out. He didn't say he stopped at the car wash. I knew he stopped at the car wash.
Ross heads to Sheet's car wash to ask for the surveillance footage.
I watched all of that, all the video downloaded on a disc, and saw McDermott pull into the car wash, slowly pull through the chassis wash, and then back up, and then slowly pull through the chassis wash again, making sure the front of that vehicle was washed. That is why those tire impressions were on the scene of the homicide. This vehicle left that tire impression and had mud in the wheel well and on the wheel, and that's why he went to the car wash. So once I get the search warrant for McDermott's car, I go to his parents' house where he was, and I have a tow truck transport it back to the sheriff's office.
We had the dog that's capable of smelling explosives do a sniff around it, and he indicated that there was the odor of explosives. And that means to us that at some point in time, there was a gun there, which was a big piece of evidence.
But so far, the evidence is purely circumstantial.
To us, that was just another piece of the puzzle that we're putting together.
The investigators need one final piece of solid evidence to catch Morgan's killer and make an arrest.
The most powerful evidence we had was something we found on her computer.
Morgan Fox wasn't going to let anyone push her around. But that same confidence put a target on her back. The evidence that proves Jason McDermott is Morgan's killer is stacking up. But there's no smoking gun just yet.
We're still doing a lot of legwork, a lot of investigating, trying to find anything we can.
If the detectives can place McDermott at the scene of the crime, they may have just enough evidence to make an arrest.
I mapped several routes from McDermott's apartment to Morgan Fox's house. With all of the video footage that I was able to obtain from the city of North Canton, we were able to identify one vehicle in that area that matched the time frame that she was murdered, and that was Jason McDermott's vehicle.
Bingo.
With all the information we were to gather, we were able to get probable cause for an arrest warrant for Jason McDermott.
About a week after Morgan's life was cut short, detectives take Jason McDermott into custody. McDermott's fixation with Morgan was evident, but an analysis of his cell phone confirms he was stalking her as well.
We found at least 100 pictures of Morgan that he had surreptitiously obtained. Her Snapchats, TikToks. We also found multiple videos that he had recorded of Morgan while she was at work.
I guess they want it done now.
In addition to that, there was a day that he went over to Morgan's house, videotaping her without her knowledge.
She was bending over, getting stuff out of the kitchen. And he just has his phone out, recording her.
And then, text to a coworker clinches it. He wasn't just upset Morgan ended their friendship. He was scared she was going to make trouble for him at work as well. When prosecutors look closer at Morgan's laptop, they find one final critical piece of evidence pointing directly to Morgan's killer.
The most powerful evidence we had was something we found on her computer.
One day before her murder, Morgan was insistent on someone acknowledging and taking action about her toxic work situation.
Morgan felt like she had exhausted all of her options at FedEx.
On the 27th, I had said to her, why don't you reach out to HR yourself? I can help you with that letter. You can CC me. We can talk about it tomorrow and go over that if you'd like.
Morgan never made it to work that day.
But what the investigators find within that email contains exactly what they need to convict Morgan's killer.
I feel like I'm being targeted at work. I'm sure speaking with you is just going to make things for me at work even worse, but at this point, I have no other choice.
Morgan wasn't going to stop advocating for herself. Jason McDermott was specifically named in the email, and he had a feeling that Morgan was going to get him fired. Morgan's email proves that his suspicions were correct. HR finally responded to Morgan's request to set up a call the following day, but by then, it was too late. This gives the prosecution everything they need to show that this was the catalyst that turned Jason from stalker to murderer.
Stalking is a sign of obsession, and obsession oftentimes leads to murder.
6 months after Morgan was murdered, Jason McDermott is on trial.
Jason McDermott got a sentence of life without the possibility of parole.
When Amelia took the stands and gave her victim statement, is the only time Jason McDermott shows any remorse, anything.
Morgan Fox's 8-year-old daughter spoke in open court before sentencing.
I wish she could see me graduate from high school. I wish she could see me get married.
I thought monsters weren't real, but you've proven me wrong.
You hurt so many people. You hurt me and the people I love.
I'm a pretty tough guy, but that statement almost brought me to tears. It was so powerful.
Morgan now serves as an example to all. Don't back down. Make yourself heard.
justice for Morgan Fox was served here, and I think the family was satisfied with the fact that he can't hurt anyone else.
Echoes on my soul, the stories that I've told.
I hope to God that if there's another woman who comes with a genuine concern of being uncomfortable while just doing her job, don't act like it's not a problem, fix it before something like this happens again.
Morgan's legacy lives on through her foundation.
My parents have started the Morgan Ashley Fox Foundation to help anyone that has lost a loved one to a victim of a crime like this.
With the letter that we found Morgan wrote the night before she was killed, had we not had that direction in this case, who knows if we would have solved it.
Morgan did it. Morgan sent the letter. Morgan put the letter together, and she was brave and courageous and hit send. She stood up for herself. I give her all the credit for that.
There is a specific kind of atmosphere that settles over a port town when the sun goes down. In the daylight, places like the harbor of Pago Pago are defined by their utility, their motion, and their breathtaking natural beauty. The deep, sheltered waters reflect the vibrant greens of the surrounding volcanic slopes, and the docks are alive with the sounds of commerce, the shifting of cargo, and the calls of fishermen. It is a place of hard work, a vital artery for the local community, and a picturesque slice of island life. But when the weekend arrives and the daylight fades, the character of the harbor undergoes a profound and often unsettling transformation. The industrial silhouettes of the port cast long, impenetrable shadows. The humid night air grows heavy, no longer carrying just the scent of salt and ocean brine, but the unmistakable, sharp tang of alcohol, the thumping bass of local nightlife, and the chaotic, unpredictable energy of youth looking for an outlet. It is in these contrasting environments, where the rugged edge of a working port meets the restless hours of the night, that the social fabric can tear with terrifying suddenness. Port towns have always held a dual identity in the collective consciousness. They are gateways to the wider world, places of arrival and departure, but they are also environments where the transient meets the established, and where the stress of working-class life often seeks release in the bottom of a bottle. In Pago Pago, this dynamic is no different. The beauty of the region is undeniable, but it exists alongside the complex, often hidden realities of substance abuse and the insidious rise of spontaneous street gangs. When young men gather under the influence of heavy drinking, the boundaries of individual morality begin to blur. The alcohol acts as a dangerous catalyst, stripping away inhibitions, amplifying perceived slights, and lowering the threshold for violence. A misplaced word, a prolonged glance, or the simple misfortune of crossing paths with the wrong group can ignite a powder keg of aggression. The pack mentality takes over, and what might have been a minor disagreement in the sobering light of day morphs into a brutal, uncontrollable frenzy in the dark. This is the grim reality that formed the backdrop of a weekend night that would shatter the peace of Pago Pago and end the life of a local man named Manny Defia Kupu. Known to those around him simply as Manu, he was a citizen of this port community, a local man whose life was deeply interwoven with the fabric of the area. Like so many others, Manu had every right to walk the streets of his hometown in safety. He had every right to expect that a weekend evening would end with him returning safely to his home. But the environment of the harbor after dark, fueled by the toxic combination of excessive alcohol consumption and deep-seated gang rivalries, had created a volatile ecosystem where human life could be abruptly and violently devalued. The night of the incident began like countless other weekend nights in the harbor district. The specific details of what Manu Kupu was doing in the hours leading up to the attack are less important than the horrifying sequence of events that awaited him. He was a local man moving through his local environment, completely unaware that he had been marked as a target. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of heavy, aggressive atmosphere that often precedes violence in areas plagued by street gangs. For the group of young men who would soon become his attackers, the night was not about leisure. It was about dominance, territoriality, and the twisted sense of power that comes from intimidation. Empowered by liquid courage and the dangerous solidarity of the group, they were hunting for an outlet for their aggression. Manu Kupu was ambushed. The term ambush implies calculation, a deliberate element of surprise, and a complete imbalance of power. He was not engaged in a fair fight or a mutual altercation. He was suddenly and violently overwhelmed by a coordinated group. But the sheer numbers of the attackers were not the only calculated aspect of this crime. In a chilling demonstration of presence of mind amidst their alcohol-fueled rage, the gang did not beat him in the open. Recognizing that violence under the streetlights might draw the attention of passers-by or law enforcement, they forcibly grabbed Manu and dragged him away from the relative safety of the public spaces. They pulled him into a secluded, poorly lit area of the port. This specific detail, the dragging of the victim into the darkness, speaks volumes about the intent of the perpetrators. It shows that despite the chaotic nature of a gang assault, there was a conscious effort to isolate the victim and to create a hidden arena where they could inflict maximum damage without the risk of immediate intervention. By pulling Manu into the shadows, they stripped him of any chance of a rescue. They ensured that his cries for help would be swallowed by the darkness and the ambient noise of the harbor. They created a designated kill zone, a place where their brutality could unfold unchecked by the eyes of the community. Once they had Manu Kupu isolated in the dark, the true horror of the attack commenced. This was not a scuffle. It was a methodical, relentless, and savage beating designed to cause catastrophic bodily harm. The attackers armed themselves with whatever was at hand, utilizing heavy sticks and makeshift clubs to magnify the force of their blows. But they did not rely solely on weapons. They used their own bodies, their fists, and their boots, raining down a continuous barrage of strikes upon the defenseless man. The violence was targeted and merciless. They did not aim for his limbs to merely incapacitate him. They directed the full force of their rage at the most vulnerable and vital areas of his anatomy. Blow after blow landed on Manu's head, snapping his neck back and causing his brain to violently impact the inside of his skull. The stick shattered against his ribs, while heavy kicks were driven directly into his chest and abdomen. The human body is remarkably resilient in many ways, but it is not built to withstand the concentrated, repetitive kinetic energy of multiple assailants wielding heavy wooden objects and steel-toed aggression. As the beating continued, the physical structure of Manu's body began to fail. Bones fractured, blood vessels ruptured, and delicate internal organs were subjected to crushing, unbearable pressure. Through all of this, the attackers showed absolutely no quarter. They did not stop when Manu fell to the ground. They did not stop when he ceased trying to defend himself. They continued their assault until his body simply shut down, beating him until he was completely unconscious, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. When the rage finally subsided and the attackers retreated back into the night, they left behind a devastating scene. Manudafia Kupu lay abandoned in the darkness, a broken man bleeding out onto the cold, unforgiving ground of the harbor district. He was left in a rapidly expanding pool of his own blood, entirely alone in the very town he called home. The casual cruelty of leaving a dying man to his fate in a dark alley is a stark testament to the dehumanizing effect of gang violence. The perpetrators walked away, likely dispersing into the night, leaving Manu to slowly slip away while the rest of the harbor continued its weekend revelry, completely oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded in the shadows. Eventually, Manu was discovered. The timeline of his discovery remains a tragic element of the night, as every minute spent bleeding in the dark severely diminished his chances of survival. Emergency services were called, and a desperate race against time began. Paramedics arrived at the grim scene, immediately recognizing the critical nature of his injuries. He was rushed to the local hospital, the sirens cutting through the heavy night air, signaling the aftermath of the violence. The medical staff in the emergency department were presented with a catastrophic trauma case. They worked frantically to stabilize him, deploying every life-saving measure available to them. However, the sheer savagery of the attack had inflicted damage that modern medicine simply could not reverse. The blunt force trauma to his head had resulted in a severe traumatic brain injury. The brain, swelling from the relentless impacts, was being suffocated within the skull, causing irreversible neurological damage. Furthermore, the kicks and blows with the sticks had caused massive internal hemorrhaging. His vital organs, specifically in the chest and abdominal cavities, had been quite literally crushed by the immense external pressure applied by the attackers. The internal bleeding was too extensive, the physiological shock too profound. Despite the exhaustive and desperate efforts of the medical professionals, Manudifia Manu Kupu succumbed to his horrific injuries. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, his life stolen by a senseless act of collective rage. The death of Manu Kupu sent an immediate shockwave through the Pago Pago community. This was not a quiet passing, it was a loud, bloody, and terrifying murder that demanded an immediate response. The local police department, confronted with the brutal reality of the crime, launched a rapid and aggressive investigation. The Port District, usually a place of chaotic movement, became a locked-down crime scene. Detectives began the arduous process of piecing together the events of the night, relying on forensic evidence left in the dark alley, the timeline of the local bars, and the eventual fracturing of the silence that often protects gang activity. Law enforcement moved swiftly to identify and isolate the suspects. Through diligent investigative work, they managed to break through the initial wall of street loyalty, successfully rounding up and arresting multiple individuals involved in the fatal beating. The swiftness of the arrests brought a small measure of relief to a terrified community, but it also laid bare the terrifying reality of who was responsible. These were young men, locals themselves, who had allowed the toxicity of gang affiliation and the heavy consumption of alcohol to turn them into killers. As the full picture of the assault came into focus, the prosecuting authorities prepared to bring the full weight of the law down upon the perpetrators. Recognizing the organized, predatory nature of the attack, the charges were severe. The individual identified as the primary instigator, the ringleader who orchestrated the ambush and escalated the violence, was hit with devastating charges. He faced indictment for second-degree murder, reflecting his extreme indifference to human life, alongside a charge of first-degree assault for the unparalleled brutality he inflicted. The rest of the group, those who willingly participated in the fatal beating and ensured Manu could not escape, were not spared. They were charged with severe gang assault and intentional injury leading to death. The case of Manudifia Kupu stands today not just as a murder file, but as a glaring, deeply disturbing alarm bell for the region. It forces the community to look at the dark underbelly of their port towns, to acknowledge the devastating consequences of alcohol abuse, and to confront the grim reality of spontaneous street gangs that can transform a peaceful weekend night into a scene of unspeakable carnage. As we delve deeper into the investigation, the trial, and the agonizing aftermath of Manu's death, we must ask ourselves how a community heals from a wound so deep, and how justice can possibly be measured against the total destruction of a human life. To truly understand the tragic fate of Manudifia Kupu, one must first understand the ground upon which he walked, the air he breathed, and the complex social ecosystem that ultimately claimed his life. Pago Pago is not merely a backdrop in this narrative. It is a central character, a living, breathing environment with its own pulse, its own deep-seated rhythms, and its own hidden fractures. Situated deep within a dramatic, naturally protected harbor, the area is geographically stunning, defined by steep, emerald-green volcanic ridges that plunge dramatically into the deep blue waters of the Pacific. It is a place of immense natural beauty, a postcard image of island life that has drawn travelers and sailors for generations. Yet, beneath this picturesque exterior lies a rugged, working-class reality, a port town driven by the relentless demands of maritime industry, commercial fishing, and the continuous movement of heavy cargo. This is a community fundamentally shaped by its relationship with the ocean. The harbor is the economic heart of the region, pumping life into the surrounding areas through the canneries and the docks. During the daylight hours, the port is a symphony of organized chaos. Massive vessels dominate the waterline, their steel hulls towering over the docks. Cranes pivot tirelessly, heavy machinery rumbles across the concrete, and the air is thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, salt spray, and the pungent, unmistakable odor of processing fish. It is an environment that demands hard, physical labor, drawing a workforce that is tough, resilient, and accustomed to the grueling realities of industrial maritime life. For the local citizens, the port is a source of livelihood, a place of pride, and the undisputed center of their economic universe. However, port towns inherently possess a dual nature, a split personality that reveals itself as the sun dips below the volcanic peaks and the heavy machinery grinds to a halt. When the daylight fades, the industrial epicenter undergoes a profound psychological and social shift. The workers, exhausted from the physical toll of the day, seek release and recreation. The docks, previously defined by purpose and productivity, become shrouded in shadows. The local bars and taverns, clustered around the waterfront to serve the working men and the transient populations of sailors, begin to fill. This is where the social fabric of Pago Pago begins to weave a darker, more volatile pattern. The transition from day to night in a harbor town is not just a change in lighting, it is a shift in the governing rules of social interaction. The discipline of the workday evaporates, replaced by an atmosphere of unrestrained escapism. In this nocturnal environment, alcohol plays a central, dominant role. It is the social lubricant, the primary mechanism for decompression, and the fuel that drives the nighttime economy. But in areas characterized by heavy industrial labor and economic pressure, alcohol consumption often transcends mere socialization. It becomes a pervasive method of coping, a way to numb the physical aches of the day and escape the perceived limitations of island life. The harborside establishments cater to this need, providing spaces where immense quantities of alcohol are consumed rapidly. This culture of heavy drinking lowers inhibitions on a mass scale, stripping away the social filters that normally keep aggressive impulses in check. It creates a highly charged atmosphere where logic is easily bypassed by emotion, where minor slights are magnified into grievous insults, and where the threshold for physical violence is dangerously lowered. Compounding the volatile nature of the alcohol-soaked nightlife is the demographic reality of the region. Like many geographically isolated communities, Pago Pago grapples with the challenge of providing adequate opportunities for its youth. Young men, coming of age in an environment dominated by the masculine, physically demanding culture of the port, often find themselves caught in a transitional void. The pathways to economic advancement can feel narrow and restricted, leading to a pervasive sense of frustration and disenfranchisement. When youthful energy, physical vitality, and a desperate need for identity and belonging are denied constructive outlets, they inevitably seek alternative, often destructive, avenues of expression. This brings us to the deeply troubling phenomenon that lay at the heart of Manudifia Kupu's murder, the emergence of spontaneous street gangs. Unlike organized crime syndicates with clear hierarchies, complex economic motives, and established codes of conduct, the gang structures in these port areas are far more fluid, informal, and erratic. They are loosely affiliated groups of young men, bound together by neighborhood proximity, shared frustrations, and a distorted sense of territorial pride. These are not criminal masterminds plotting elaborate heists. They are packs of youths whose collective identity is largely forged in opposition to others. Their currency is not money, but reputation, fear, and the hypermasculine posturing that flourishes in the shadows of the harbor. The spontaneity of these groups makes them incredibly dangerous. Their violence is rarely calculated for financial gain. Rather, it is reactive, emotionally driven, and often ignited by the most trivial of triggers. A wrong look across a crowded bar, a misinterpreted gesture on the street, or simply the presence of an unfamiliar face in what they consider their territory can be enough to spark a brutal confrontation. When these young men consume heavy amounts of alcohol, the precarious balance of their collective psyche tips entirely toward aggression. The pack mentality takes over, overriding any individual sense of morality or restraint. The group becomes a single, unpredictable organism, roaming the nighttime streets with a shared desire to exert dominance and inflict harm upon anyone who crosses their path. This specific brand of violence is characterized by a shocking lack of empathy. In the heat of an alcohol-fueled gang assault, the victim ceases to be a human being and becomes merely an object upon which the group can project its collective rage. The perpetrators feed off each other's energy, each blow escalating the frenzy, pushing the violence to levels of savagery that no single individual would likely commit on their own. It is a terrifying manifestation of localized tribalism, where the laws of civilized society are temporarily suspended, replaced by the brutal, primitive law of the pack. The port, with its dark alleys, its hidden corners, and its inherent transience, provides the perfect stage for this predatory behavior to unfold unnoticed until it is far too late. It was into this specific, highly volatile ecosystem that Manutefia Kupu was born, raised, and ultimately destroyed. Manu was not a stranger to Pago Pago. He was an integral part of it. The case files describe him simply and powerfully as a local citizen. This designation carries immense weight in the context of an island community. To be a local citizen means to be woven deeply into the fabric of the town. It means knowing the subtle shifts in the weather, recognizing the faces on the street, and understanding the unwritten rules of the harbor. Manu was a familiar presence, a man who likely had deep roots in the community, with connections, friendships, and a history tied inextricably to the volcanic soil and the salty air of the port. Because of this deep familiarity, Manu moved through Pago Pago with a sense of belonging and an inherent feeling of safety. The streets where he walked were the same streets he had known his entire life. The harbor, for all its rugged edges and nighttime complexities, was his home. He understood the rhythm of the port, the transition from the industrious day to the chaotic night, and he likely believed he knew how to navigate it without incident. This is the profound tragedy of his position as a victim. He was not a tourist wandering blindly into a dangerous neighborhood. He was a local man who possessed a natural, understandable comfort in his own surroundings. He had no reason to believe that a standard weekend night would transform his hometown into a lethal trap. We must consider the psychology of a man simply trying to exist in his own community. Manu Kupu represented the everyday citizen, the ordinary individual who expects and deserves the basic human right to walk safely in their own environment. He was not involved in the posturing or the territorial disputes that consumed the younger, disenfranchised men of the area. He was merely present, occupying space in a town that was rightfully his. But the tragic reality of Pago Pago's nocturnal shift is that familiarity does not guarantee immunity. When the volatile mixture of spontaneous gang affiliation and severe alcohol abuse reaches its boiling point, it does not discriminate. It simply looks for a target, an outlet for its explosive energy. Manu Kupu became that target not because of who he was, but simply because he was there. His status as a local citizen, a man at ease in his environment, made him tragically vulnerable to an ambush. He did not anticipate the sudden, violent rupture of the peace because he viewed the harbor through the lens of a local, seeing his home rather than a hunting ground. He could not have foreseen that the young men who shared his town, who grew up in the same shadows of the same mountains, had allowed the toxic culture of the nighttime port to strip away their humanity. The portrait of Manutefia Kupu is, therefore, a reflection of Pago Pago itself. He embodies the honest, established side of the port, the community that relies on the harbor for life and sustenance. Conversely, his attackers represent the darkest, most unstable elements of the same environment, the byproduct of social frustration and unchecked substance abuse. When these two opposing forces collided on that fateful weekend night, it was not merely an altercation. It was a devastating intersection of a town's worst systemic failures crashing down upon a single, unsuspecting life. The story of Manu Kupu forces us to examine how a community can simultaneously nurture its citizens and harbor the very conditions that lead to their brutal, senseless destruction. The port of Pago Pago stands as a silent, monolithic witness to this tragic duality, a place where the stunning beauty of the island is forever stained by the realities of violence that lurk in its deepest shadows. The transition from the chaotic, alcohol-fueled night to the sobering, harsh light of dawn in the harbor of Pago Pago is rarely a gentle process, but on the morning following the brutal assault on Manudifia Kupu, the tropical sunrise felt particularly unforgiving. As the first rays of morning light crested the steep, emerald volcanic ridges and spilled down into the industrial sectors of the port, they illuminated a reality that the darkness had temporarily concealed. The hidden, secluded alleyway, carefully chosen by the attackers for its oppressive shadows and complete lack of visibility, was now brutally exposed to the daylight. The discovery of the scene was not made by the perpetrators reflecting on their actions, nor was it initially found by the police. It was likely stumbled upon by an early morning dock worker or a local resident beginning their daily routine, a sudden, horrifying encounter with the physical remnants of extreme violence. The immediate call to emergency services triggered a rapid, escalating response that completely shattered the quiet morning routine of the waterfront. When the first patrol cars arrived, their sirens cutting sharply through the humid morning air, the officers were met with a scene of absolute devastation that immediately indicated a crime of extraordinary savagery. The area was immediately cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape, a stark, unnatural boundary marking the exact location where civilized society had failed. Detectives from the local police department descended upon the harbor, stepping into a localized epicenter of tragedy. The initial crime scene assessment is always a critical, highly sensitive phase of any homicide investigation, a meticulous process of reading the physical narrative left behind in the dirt and concrete. In this narrow, debris-strewn corridor, the story was chillingly clear and overwhelmingly violent. The most prominent and disturbing piece of evidence was the massive, dark stain of pooled blood soaking heavily into the unpaved ground, a grim indicator of the catastrophic internal and external hemorrhaging Manu had suffered during the prolonged attack. Surrounding this central, tragic focal point, the forensic technicians began the arduous task of cataloging the chaos. They documented the disturbed earth, the scuff marks on the rough concrete walls, and the scattered, discarded fragments of heavy, blood-stained wooden sticks that had been used with such devastating effect. What immediately struck the lead investigators was the sheer volume and varied nature of the physical evidence. The chaotic overlapping of numerous, distinct sets of heavy boot prints in the dirt, the multiple points of impact scattered across the alley, and the sheer scale of the blood spatter patterns all pointed to a singular, terrifying conclusion. This was not the tragic outcome of a one-on-one altercation that had accidentally escalated. This was a highly coordinated, multi-directional, and overwhelming assault perpetrated by a sizable group of individuals acting in brutal unison. The immediate challenge facing the investigative team was the oppressive, suffocating wall of silence that typically descends over a port town in the aftermath of gang-related violence. Communities built around maritime industry, characterized by transient populations, heavy labor, and deeply entrenched local loyalties, often possess a complex, deeply ingrained reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement. This reluctance is not necessarily born of a desire to protect murderers, but rather stems from a pervasive, very real fear of swift and violent retaliation from the very street gangs responsible for the crime. The detectives knew that in the crowded, alcohol-soaked waterfront bars on the night of the murder, someone had to have seen the initial confrontation. Someone had to have noticed the group forcibly dragging a man into the darkness, or, at the very least, someone had to have seen the perpetrators fleeing the scene, their clothes inevitably stained with the irrefutable biological evidence of their crime. Yet, as the police began their initial canvassing operations, knocking on doors, questioning bartenders, and interviewing the dock workers who populated the area, they were met with averted eyes, sudden cases of profound amnesia, and a uniform, frustrating insistence of total ignorance. The spontaneous, localized nature of the gang involved made them particularly unpredictable and terrifying to the general public. They were not a structured syndicate with predictable patterns. They were a volatile, localized pack, making the local residents acutely aware that speaking to the police could easily make them the next target in a dark alley. While the street-level investigation met with immense friction, the medical examiner's office provided the detectives with a cold, undeniable, and scientifically rigorous narrative of the assault. The autopsy of Manudifia Kupu was a grueling, heartbreaking medical procedure that fully laid bare the absolute ruthlessness of his attackers. The forensic pathologist carefully documented a catastrophic constellation of injuries that defied basic human comprehension. The trauma to the cranium was extensive and devastating, characterized by multiple severe fractures and a profound, fatal swelling of the brain tissue, clear evidence of continuous, high-velocity blunt force trauma delivered with heavy objects. Furthermore, the examination of the thoracic and abdominal cavities revealed a horrifying level of structural collapse. Ribs had been splintered and driven inward, and vital internal organs exhibited massive, irreparable ruptures consistent with being subjected to immense, concentrated crushing forces, such as the repeated, full-weight impacts of heavy steel-toed work boots. The medical examiner's final report provided the investigators with a definitive cause of death, but more importantly, it provided them with a psychological profile of the crime itself. The sheer excess of the violence, the continuation of the brutal beating long after the victim was incapacitated, suggested a group dynamic fueled by extreme emotional contagion, deep-seated aggression, and heavy intoxication. It confirmed that the detectives were hunting a pack of individuals who had completely surrendered their basic humanity to the collective frenzy of the mob. Armed with the agonizing details of the autopsy, the detectives intensified their pressure on the Harbor community. They understood that the silence of a spontaneous street gang is fundamentally different from the disciplined omerta of organized crime. These were not seasoned, hardened professional criminals. They were young, impulsive, and largely disorganized men whose bond was forged entirely in the volatile fires of local territoriality and excessive alcohol consumption. The investigators knew that this type of loyalty is inherently brittle, highly susceptible to internal paranoia, and destined to fracture under sustained, strategic psychological pressure. The investigative breakthrough, the crucial turning point in the case of Manu Kupu, did not come from a dramatic forensic match or a sudden, cinematic confession, but rather from the slow, methodical exploitation of this very specific gang dynamic. The police began by heavily targeting the periphery of the group, utilizing whatever fragmented surveillance footage they could recover from the commercial areas of the port and piecing together a timeline of the various groups of young men who were known to frequent the waterfront establishments that specific weekend night. Through a painstaking process of elimination and the strategic application of pressure on known associates for minor, unrelated infractions, the formidable wall of silence finally, inevitably began to show microscopic cracks. The narrative of the night slowly began to emerge through indirect channels. Rumors, fueled by the irrepressible human urge to talk about traumatic events, began to circulate through the community. Young men under the influence of alcohol are notoriously poor at keeping secrets, and the perpetrators, perhaps initially emboldened by their perceived dominance or conversely terrified by the sobering, daylight realization that they had committed a brutal murder, had inevitably spoken. A fragmented account reached the ears of the investigators, a whispered admission of involvement, a panicked boast made in the dark corners of a local tavern, or perhaps a terrified confession from a peripheral member of the group who was crumbling under the immense psychological weight of his own complicity. The police seized upon this microscopic fissure, pulling at the thread with relentless determination. They identified a vulnerable link within the suspect group, an individual whose psychological profile suggested he would not be able to withstand the intense, isolated pressure of a formal police interrogation. When this individual was finally brought into the sterile, unforgiving environment of the interrogation room, entirely separated from the false courage and physical protection of his gang, the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The detectives employed a masterful, highly controlled interrogation strategy. They did not shout or resort to aggressive intimidation. Instead, they laid out the sheer, terrifying gravity of the forensic evidence. They described the medical examiner's findings in cold, clinical detail, explicitly detailing the horrific manner in which Manu Kupu had died. They systematically dismantled the suspect's flimsy alibi, highlighting the undeniable fact that a man was dead and multiple people were going to spend the rest of their lives in a federal penitentiary. The crucial psychological pivot was the introduction of the legal concept of joint enterprise and felony murder. The detectives made it brutally clear that loyalty to the gang would not protect him from the consequences of the fatal blows, even if he had not struck the final, lethal strike himself. Faced with the insurmountable evidence, the terrifying prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, and the sudden, isolating realization that the gang could not protect him from the law, the suspect's resolve completely disintegrated. The dam broke, and the true, horrifying sequence of events spilled out into the open. The confession was likely a chaotic mixture of self-preservation, minimized personal involvement, and terrified finger-pointing, but it provided the police with the one thing they desperately needed: names. With the identities of the perpetrators finally secured, the investigation shifted from a slow, methodical gathering of information to a rapid, highly coordinated tactical operation. The police moved with absolute precision and overwhelming force, determined to apprehend the suspects before they could coordinate their stories, destroy further evidence, or attempt to flee the island jurisdiction entirely. Arrest warrants were executed simultaneously across multiple locations in Pago Pago. The swift, decisive action of law enforcement served to entirely neutralize the gang's capacity to react. The individuals who had felt so powerful, so untouchable while swarming a defenseless man in the absolute darkness of an alleyway, were suddenly and violently dragged out of their beds and homes into the harsh light of day, their wrists secured in steel cuffs, their false bravado completely shattered by the overwhelming reality of their impending legal destruction. Among the sudden wave of arrests, the investigators placed a specific, highly focused emphasis on identifying the central catalyst of the violence, the individual who had fundamentally dictated the brutal trajectory of the night. Through the cross-referencing of the terrified confessions and the analysis of the group's internal hierarchy, they successfully isolated the primary instigator, the undisputed ringleader of the pack. This was the individual who had not only participated in the fatal beating but had actively orchestrated the initial ambush, who had made the calculated, malicious decision to drag Manu Kupu into the concealed darkness, and who had violently escalated the physical assault to a lethal threshold. The identification and capture of the mastermind was the crucial culmination of the investigation. It represented the total, systematic dismantling of the spontaneous street gang that had terrorized the harbor, transforming them from a faceless, terrifying mob in the night into a group of isolated, terrified defendants facing the absolute most severe consequences of the criminal justice system. The rapid, successful conclusion of the investigative phase brought a collective sigh of relief to the fearful residents of Pago Pago, but as the cell doors slammed shut on the perpetrators, the true legal battle to secure justice for Manudifia Kupu was only just beginning to take shape. The transition from the chaotic, unpredictable energy of the Pago Pago harbor to the sterile, highly structured environment of the territorial courthouse represents a profound shift in the pursuit of justice. The streets, where the brutal assault on Manudifia Kupu occurred, are governed by the raw, unforgiving dynamics of physical force, intoxication, and the spontaneous, terrifying mob mentality of localized street gangs. The courtroom, however, is deliberately designed to be the exact antithesis of that primal chaos. It is a space defined by rigid procedural rules, absolute silence, and the slow, methodical dissection of human actions under the harsh, uncompromising fluorescent lights of legal scrutiny. When the trial of the young men accused of the brutal murder finally commenced, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom sealed off the tropical humidity and the distant sounds of the working port, plunging the perpetrators, the family of the victim, and the entire watchful community into a tense, agonizing crucible of accountability. The atmosphere within the gallery was incredibly thick, charged with the collective grief of a community that had lost a beloved local citizen and the palpable, nervous dread of the defendants who were suddenly entirely stripped of the artificial power they had wielded in the darkness of the alleyway. The prosecuting attorneys faced a complex, monumental task in constructing their legal narrative. Trying a group of individuals for a mob-style beating is inherently difficult because the chaotic nature of the assault often blurs the lines of individual responsibility. However, the prosecution had meticulously built a case designed to cut through the confusion, clearly delineating the specific roles and the distinct levels of culpability among the attackers. They structured their entire strategy around the irrefutable physical evidence and the horrifying timeline of the ambush, refusing to allow the defendants to hide behind the collective anonymity of the gang. The charges laid before the court were severe, reflecting the absolute savagery of the crime. The prosecution carefully separated the defendants into two distinct legal categories, focusing the most devastating legal firepower on the individual identified by law enforcement as the primary instigator. This ringleader, the central catalyst of the violence, faced the crushing weight of a second-degree murder indictment, combined with an additional charge of first-degree assault. The remaining members of the group, the willing participants who had formed the inescapable physical barrier around the victim, were indicted for severe gang assault and intentional injury leading to death, charges that accurately reflected their crucial role in facilitating and executing the fatal beating. To secure a conviction for second-degree murder against a ringleader, the prosecution did not necessarily have to prove premeditation in the traditional sense of a carefully planned assassination. Instead, they had to unequivocally demonstrate to the jury that the defendant possessed a depraved heart, a state of mind characterized by an absolute, callous indifference to the value of human life. The prosecution argued forcefully that the very act of targeting an isolated local citizen, orchestrating an overwhelming ambush, and intentionally dragging him away from the ambient light of the street into a secluded, pitch-black industrial alleyway was a clear, undeniable demonstration of malicious intent. They painted a vivid, horrifying picture for the jury, explaining that the alley was deliberately chosen as a kill zone, a hidden arena where the gang could unleash maximum physical destruction without the immediate threat of intervention. By forcibly isolating Manny Defia, Kupu in the darkness, the ringleader and his pack had actively and consciously stripped away his only chance of survival, a tactical decision that elevated the crime far beyond a simple, drunken street brawl gone tragically wrong. The most harrowing and emotionally devastating phase of the trial arrived when the prosecution called the medical examiner to the witness stand. In a courtroom where the defense desperately attempted to minimize the violence, the cold, clinical, and absolutely irrefutable testimony of the forensic pathologist served as the ultimate, inescapable truth of the night. The medical examiner systematically detailed the catastrophic catalog of injuries inflicted upon the victim, transforming the abstract legal concepts of assault and murder into a visceral, deeply disturbing reality for the jury. Without relying on sensationalism, the clinical description of the blunt force trauma was enough to send a visible shockwave through the gallery. The jury was forced to listen as the pathologist explained the immense kinetic energy required to cause the extensive fracturing of the cranium and the subsequent, fatal swelling of the delicate brain tissue inside the skull. The testimony then moved to the devastating internal damage, meticulously detailing how the victim's ribs had been violently splintered and how his vital organs had been quite literally crushed by the immense, concentrated pressure of heavy steel-toed boots repeatedly driving into his chest and abdomen. This medical evidence was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, conclusively proving that the attackers had utilized heavy wooden sticks and their own footwear not merely to injure, but to utterly destroy the biological infrastructure of a human being. Facing this overwhelming mountain of forensic and testimonial evidence, the defense attorneys found themselves backed into an incredibly narrow, desperate legal corner. Their primary strategy revolved around the aggressive utilization of the intoxication defense, an attempt to use the very catalyst of the crime as a shield against the most severe legal consequences. The defense argued that the extreme volume of alcohol consumed by the defendants on the night in question had severely diminished their cognitive capacity, completely overriding their ability to form the specific, malicious intent required for a murder conviction. They attempted to paint the incident not as a calculated ambush, but as a spontaneous, chaotic eruption of drunken aggression, a terrible, tragic accident born entirely of substance abuse and the uncontrollable, psychological contagion of mob mentality. The defense heavily leaned into the chaotic nature of the beating, attempting to diffuse the responsibility across the entire group, arguing that in the pitch-black darkness of the alley, it was impossible to definitively prove which specific blow from which specific defendant had actually caused the fatal injuries. They pleaded with the jury to downgrade the charges, arguing that while the young men were certainly guilty of a terrible assault, they did not possess the cold, calculating mind of a murderer. This strategy, however, was fundamentally flawed and morally hollow in the face of the established facts. The prosecution ruthlessly dismantled the alcohol defense during their cross-examinations and closing arguments. They continuously brought the jury's attention back to the deliberate, coordinated actions that occurred before the lethal blows were ever struck. The act of waiting in the shadows, the synchronized rushing of the victim, and, most crucially, the physical effort required to violently drag a struggling man away from the street and into a hidden, secluded area all required a level of presence of mind, spatial awareness, and coordinated teamwork that completely contradicted the narrative of mindless, drunken stumbling. The prosecution argued that alcohol may have lowered their inhibitions and fueled their aggression, but it did not magically create the heavy wooden sticks they brought to the fight, nor did it force them to specifically target the most vulnerable, vital areas of Manutofia Kupu's body long after he had been beaten into a state of absolute unconsciousness. The intent to kill, or at the very least the complete, depraved disregard for whether the victim lived or died, was written clearly in the massive pool of blood left behind on the concrete and in the shattered, broken remnants of his physical form. As the trial progressed, the deeply fractured nature of the street gang became increasingly evident to the jury. The solidarity that had seemingly bound the young men together in the harbor, the toxic loyalty that had empowered them to act as a unified, predatory pack, completely dissolved under the terrifying threat of lengthy prison sentences. The defendants who faced the lesser, though still incredibly severe, charges of gang assault and intentional injury leading to death actively sought to distance themselves from the ringleader. They attempted to minimize their own physical involvement, casting the primary instigator as an uncontrollable, violent force who had unexpectedly escalated the confrontation beyond their intentions. This internal betrayal, the desperate scrambling for self-preservation at the expense of their former associates, laid bare the inherent cowardice of the gang structure. It demonstrated to the court that their collective identity was entirely superficial, built on a foundation of cheap alcohol and bravado, destined to crumble the moment they were forced to face the individual, devastating consequences of their shared savagery. The closing arguments delivered by the prosecution were a powerful, resonant plea for justice and a stark reminder of the immense human cost of the crime. They asked the jury to remember Manutofia Kupu not just as a name on a medical examiner's report, but as a living, breathing local citizen who had every fundamental human right to walk the streets of his own hometown in peace. They emphasized that a verdict of guilty on the highest charges was necessary not only to hold the specific perpetrators accountable for their monstrous actions, but to send an unequivocal, resounding message to the entire port community of Pago Pago. The verdict needed to establish a clear, immovable legal boundary, declaring that the dangerous culture of excessive alcohol abuse and spontaneous gang violence would no longer be tolerated, and that the shadows of the harbor could never again be used as a shield against the absolute authority of the law. Following the final instructions from the presiding judge, the jury was sequestered to begin their deliberations, plunging the courthouse into an agonizing, suspended state of waiting. The hours stretched endlessly, filled with the heavy, suffocating anxiety that precedes a permanent alteration of multiple human lives. When the jury finally signaled they had reached a decision, the courtroom rapidly filled to capacity, a tense silence falling over the gallery as the foreperson prepared to read the verdicts. The reading of the decisions was a sequential, devastating blow to the defendants. The jury entirely rejected the defense's narrative of a drunken accident. The ringleader, the individual who had orchestrated the ambush and escalated the brutality, was found guilty on all counts, including the primary charge of second-degree murder and first-degree assault. The court found that his actions exhibited a depraved, unforgivable indifference to the life of the victim. The remaining accomplices were similarly found guilty of their severe charges, legally cementing their role in the fatal gang assault and the intentional injuries that directly resulted in death. As the gavel struck the sounding block, confirming the guilty verdicts, it marked the definitive, legal end of the violent street gang that had claimed the life of Manutofia Kupu, holding each individual member completely and terribly accountable for the blood they had spilled in the darkness. The final strike of the presiding judge's gavel inside the territorial courthouse did not merely signal the end of a complex legal proceeding, it served as the definitive, heavy closure to one of the most brutal and senseless chapters in the recent history of Pago Pago. The sentencing phase of a murder trial is always a deeply sobering experience, a moment where the abstract concepts of law and justice are forcefully translated into hard, irreversible years of human confinement. For the young men standing before the bench, stripped entirely of the toxic bravado and the dangerous pack mentality that had fueled their nighttime rampage, the reality of their situation finally crashed down with crushing permanence. The ringleader, the individual who had deliberately orchestrated the ambush and escalated the sheer savagery of the attack, was handed a devastating prison sentence commensurate with his convictions for second-degree murder and first-degree assault. The court ensured that he would spend the foreseeable future, perhaps the entirety of his adult life, locked inside a federal penitentiary, a stark and unforgiving environment far removed from the ocean breezes of his island home. His accomplices, the willing participants who had formed the impenetrable wall of violence around the victim, faced their own lengthy terms of incarceration for severe gang assault and intentional injury leading to death. As the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open and the newly convicted felons were led away in shackles, the community witnessed the total, unglamorous destruction of a spontaneous street gang, a group of young men who had traded their youth, their freedom, and their futures for a fleeting, alcohol-soaked illusion of power in a dark alleyway. However, the legal resolution of the case, no matter how comprehensive or severe, could not undo the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the night in question. The imprisonment of the perpetrators provided a necessary measure of societal accountability, but it offered absolutely no genuine comfort to those who were forced to navigate the permanent, agonizing void left behind by the murder. Manny Defia Kupu was entirely erased from the world of the living, his future violently stolen by individuals who lacked the basic human capacity for empathy. The tragedy of his death lies heavily in its profound senselessness. He was not a combatant in a gang war, nor was he engaged in any high-risk behavior that might have somehow contextualized his demise. He was simply a local citizen, a man deeply interwoven into the daily fabric of the harbor community, who had the fundamental misfortune of crossing paths with a roaming concentration of displaced anger and severe intoxication. The physical space where he lost his life, that secluded, debris-strewn alleyway hidden among the industrial infrastructure of the port, has now become a permanent, invisible monument to his suffering. For the local residents who must walk past that area, the shadows hold a chilling resonance, a constant, haunting reminder of the night the civilized rules of their hometown were brutally suspended, replaced by a terrifying display of primal, unrestrained savagery. The official case files, carefully compiled by law enforcement and the prosecuting attorneys, explicitly position the murder of Manny Defia Kupu as a resounding, unavoidable alarm bell for the entire region. The tragedy forces a deeply uncomfortable but entirely necessary reckoning with the systemic, underlying diseases that have silently infected the socio-economic ecosystem of the harbor. The most glaring and destructive of these catalysts is the rampant, normalized abuse of alcohol. In working-class port towns, where physical labor is grueling and economic pressures are a constant, suffocating reality, alcohol frequently transitions from a tool of casual socialization into a dangerous, pervasive coping mechanism. On the night of the murder, the staggering volume of liquor consumed by the perpetrators acted as a lethal chemical accelerant. It systematically dismantled their cognitive restraints, silenced their moral compass, and amplified their basest, most aggressive instincts. The brutal reality is that the sheer level of sustained, mechanical violence inflicted upon the victim would likely have been psychologically impossible for these young men to execute in a state of absolute sobriety. The case demands that the community reevaluate its relationship with substance abuse, challenging the cultural normalization of extreme binge drinking that continuously transforms the nighttime harbor into a volatile, unpredictable, and inherently dangerous environment. Equally disturbing is the glaring spotlight this case shines upon the insidious rise of spontaneous street gangs within the Port District. Unlike traditional organized crime syndicates, which operate with clear hierarchies and specific financial objectives, these localized groups are characterized by their chaotic, structureless, and highly reactive nature. They are born from a dangerous combination of youth disenfranchisement, a desperate lack of constructive social outlets, and the hypermasculine, territorial culture that often flourishes in industrial waterfront areas. These young men, feeling alienated from the broader economic success of the region, seek identity, belonging, and a twisted sense of respect through intimidation and collective dominance. When they roam the streets as a unified pack, their individual identities dissolve into a single, highly aggressive organism. The murder of Manudafia Kupu was the terrifying apex of this gang mentality. It demonstrated how easily a group of disconnected youths, bonded only by proximity and shared frustration, can morph into a lethal force capable of executing a coordinated, merciless ambush upon an innocent member of their own community. The tragic event highlights the desperate, urgent need for robust social interventions, community outreach programs, and viable economic pathways designed specifically to pull vulnerable young men out of the shadows before their aimless frustration hardens into murderous intent. The profound vulnerability of the ordinary citizen in the face of this specific brand of violence is perhaps the most chilling takeaway from the entire ordeal. Pago Pago, with its breathtaking natural beauty and its bustling daytime economy, is ultimately a shared space. It relies on a foundational, unspoken social contract that guarantees basic physical safety for its residents. The perpetrators of this crime violently tore that contract to pieces. They turned a familiar, everyday environment into a fatal trap, proving that the deepest dangers do not always come from outside invaders, but often originate from within the community itself, festering in the neglected corners of the social structure. For a local man to be dragged into the darkness and beaten to death in his own hometown is a systemic failure of the highest order. It shatters the illusion of safety, forcing every resident to view the nighttime streets with a heightened, deeply cynical sense of caution. The harbor, previously a symbol of economic vitality and local pride, is now permanently scarred by the knowledge of what its darkest corners can conceal when the vigilance of the community is allowed to lapse. In the long, difficult aftermath of the trial, the port town of Pago Pago is left to grapple with a complex, deeply painful legacy. The immediate threat has been neutralized, the specific perpetrators have been removed from society, and the streets are ostensibly safer. However, the underlying conditions that birthed the violence, the heavy reliance on alcohol as an escape and the creeping, toxic influence of localized gang culture, remain stubbornly entrenched in the environment. True justice for Manudafia Kupu cannot be entirely achieved within the confines of a courtroom. It must be pursued out on the streets through a sustained, collective effort to fundamentally change the culture of the harbor after dark. The community must actively reclaim its public spaces, demanding better illumination in the industrial sectors, increased, proactive patrols during the volatile weekend hours, and a rigid, zero-tolerance approach to the aggressive, pack-style posturing that preceded the fatal assault. The profound shock of the murder must be channeled into a relentless drive for structural reform, ensuring that the warning bell rung by this tragedy is not simply heard and then slowly forgotten, but actively used as a catalyst for permanent, life-saving change. The story of the Manu Kupu case is a grim, unflinching exploration of human cruelty and environmental volatility. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that civilization is often a remarkably thin veneer, easily stripped away by the potent combination of intoxicating substances and the primitive, unchecked aggression of the mob. When we look at the beautiful, emerald ridges surrounding Pago Pago Harbor today, we must simultaneously acknowledge the deep, impenetrable shadows that gather at their base. Manudafia Kupu's life was tragically and violently extinguished within those shadows, a victim of a society that failed to recognize the growing darkness within its own youth. As the years pass and the heavy steel infrastructure of the port continues its endless cycle of loading and unloading, his memory must serve as a permanent, protective beacon for the town. It is a somber, enduring reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that community requires constant, active vigilance, and that the true measure of a port town is not found in the sheer volume of cargo it moves during the day, but in the fundamental humanity and compassion it manages to fiercely protect in the darkest, most vulnerable hours of the night. The relentless march of time possesses a distinct, almost indifferent quality in a maritime environment, where the daily rhythm is dictated not by human emotion but by the uncompromising schedules of global shipping, the mechanical rise and fall of heavy steel cranes, and the eternal, rhythmic pushing and pulling of the Pacific tides. In the years following the catastrophic violence that claimed the life of Manutofia Kupu, the physical infrastructure of the Pago Pago harbor remained largely unchanged, stubbornly continuing its industrial duties under the harsh tropical sun. Massive cargo vessels still arrived and departed, slicing through the deep azure waters with massive mechanical indifference, while the local workforce continued to pour their physical labor into the demanding machinery of the local canneries and the sprawling concrete docks. Yet, beneath this veneer of operational normalcy, a profound and permanent psychological shift had occurred, altering the very atmosphere of the port and redefining the way the local community interacted with its own geographic boundaries. The physical geography of the town had not been altered, but the emotional topography had been irreparably scarred, leaving behind a complex, invisible network of trauma, hypervigilance, and lingering sorrow that wove itself into the daily existence of every citizen who remembered the tragedy. To understand the long-term aftermath of such a brutal, localized crime, one must examine the insidious nature of community trauma and how it systematically dismantles the inherent trust that allows a society to function. Before the murder, the harbor after dark, despite its raucous energy and its rough edges, was still fundamentally viewed as a shared communal space, a local environment where citizens like Manu could walk with a reasonable expectation of basic safety. The sheer randomness and the overwhelming savagery of his death shattered that foundational assumption, replacing the comfort of familiarity with a cold, paralyzing wave of communal anxiety. The residents of Pago Pago were forced to confront the terrifying reality that the profound darkness cloaking the industrial alleyways was no longer just an absence of light, but a potentially lethal camouflage hiding predators who shared their same zip code, their same cultural background, and their same local history. This realization fundamentally changed the sociology of the town, prompting a collective retreat from the public spaces once the sun went down, as citizens instinctively sought the security of their locked homes, fundamentally surrendering the nighttime harbor to the ghosts of the past and the lingering anxieties of the present. The nighttime economy of the waterfront, once a thriving, chaotic hub of social release for the exhausted working class, found itself operating under a heavy, unspoken shadow of suspicion and profound regret. The bars and taverns, where the lethal combination of excessive alcohol and unchecked gang posturing had originally been permitted to incubate, were forced into a harsh, uncompromising period of self-reflection and systemic operational change. The tragedy served as a brutal, undeniable indictment of a culture that had historically turned a blind eye to the dangerous escalation of binge drinking and the aggressive territorial disputes of disenfranchised youth. In the wake of the trial, a newfound, rigid vigilance settled over these establishments, replacing the previous atmosphere of unbridled escapism with a tense, heavily monitored environment where bartenders and patrons alike watched carefully for the slightest signs of escalating aggression or the dangerous, pack-like mobilization of young men. The carefree innocence of the harbor nightlife had been entirely extinguished, permanently replaced by a grim, collective determination to prevent the toxic recipe of liquor and localized anger from ever again reaching the catastrophic boiling point that had resulted in the violent execution of an innocent man. Meanwhile, deep within the sterile, heavily fortified confines of the federal penitentiary system, the young men responsible for the horrific crime were slowly being consumed by the absolute, crushing finality of their new existence. The spontaneous street gang, which had once drawn its artificial power from the dark alleys of the port, the intoxicating effects of cheap alcohol, and the cowardly synergy of numerical superiority, completely ceased to exist the moment they were stripped of their freedom. Inside the prison walls, they were no longer a terrifying, unified pack that could dominate the night, They were isolated, vulnerable individuals swallowed whole by a massive, impersonal institutional machine that cared absolutely nothing for their past local reputations or their territorial posturings. The heavy wooden sticks and the steel-toed boots that had served as their instruments of death were replaced by uniform jumpsuits and the relentless, soul-crushing monotony of a heavily regulated daily routine. The grand, terrifying illusion of control and dominance they had so desperately sought to project on that fateful weekend night had ultimately purchased them nothing but decades of profound isolation, deep regret, and the inescapable, daily realization that they had permanently destroyed their own lives in the exact same moment they chose to senselessly extinguish the life of another human being. The profound tragedy of Manudifia Kupu's death extends far beyond the immediate geographic confines of Pago Pago, serving as a bleak, universally applicable cautionary tale for port towns and industrial communities scattered across the globe. These environments, uniquely characterized by their transient populations, their reliance on exhausting physical labor, and their historical struggles with systemic substance abuse, frequently serve as fertile breeding grounds for the specific type of spontaneous, hypermasculine violence that claimed Manu's life. The case highlights a desperate, universally unmet need to actively engage with disenfranchised youth who find themselves trapped in the peripheral shadows of these demanding economic hubs. When young men are denied access to meaningful social mobility, constructive mentorship, and a genuine sense of civic purpose, their inherent energy and their deep-seated desire for belonging inevitably curdle into something toxic and destructive. The violence they perpetrate is rarely born of complex criminal calculation. Rather, it is a desperate, tragic, and entirely misguided attempt to assert significance in a world that has largely ignored them, utilizing the only currency they feel they possess, the capacity to instill fear and inflict physical pain upon those who are more vulnerable than themselves. Navigating the complex emotional landscape of grief and legal resolution, the family of Manudifia Kupu was forced to endure a uniquely public and deeply agonizing journey. The justice system, for all its rigid procedural mechanisms and its capacity to impose severe punitive measures, possesses an inherent, heartbreaking limitation. It can never restore what has been permanently taken. The guilty verdicts and the lengthy prison sentences handed down to the perpetrators provided a necessary, structural validation of the community's outrage, but they offered absolutely no functional solution to the profound, aching void left at the center of the Kupu family. They were left to manage a lifelong sentence of their own, a permanent, inescapable reality defined by the devastating absence of a beloved son, a cherished brother, and an irreplaceable member of their immediate social fabric. Their private mourning was tragically intertwined with the public narrative of the trial, forcing them to repeatedly confront the horrific, clinical details of Manu's final moments, ensuring that the process of achieving legal closure simultaneously reopened their deepest emotional wounds, leaving a complex legacy of trauma that would undoubtedly echo through their family lineage for generations to come. In analyzing the broader sociological implications of the crime, one must inevitably confront the terrifying fragility of the unwritten social contract that governs human interaction in shared public spaces. Civilization is not a permanent, physical structure. It is a delicate, constantly negotiated psychological agreement among individuals to suppress their most primal, aggressive instincts in exchange for collective security and mutual benefit. The brutal assault in the harbor alleyway was a localized, catastrophic failure of this agreement, a terrifying demonstration of how quickly the veneer of modern humanity can be stripped away when the inhibiting factors of empathy, accountability, and sobriety are forcefully removed. The attackers did not simply break the law. They fundamentally rejected the core tenets of human decency, regressing into a state of sheer, animalistic savagery that shocks the conscience precisely because it reveals the dark, violent potential that slumbers beneath the surface of any society. This stark realization leaves a permanent, unsettling residue in the minds of the local populace, a quiet, lingering anxiety that whispers from the shadows, reminding them that safety is an illusion that must be actively, consciously maintained, lest the darkness be allowed to rise up and reclaim the streets. Law enforcement agencies operating in the region were profoundly impacted by the grim realities exposed during the investigation and subsequent trial, leading to a comprehensive, systemic reevaluation of their community policing strategies. The reactive model of law enforcement, which focuses primarily on responding to crimes after they have already been committed, was exposed as tragically insufficient in dealing with the volatile, unpredictable nature of spontaneous gang violence. In the aftermath of the murder, local police departments recognized the critical imperative to pivot towards a heavily proactive, deeply integrated approach to community engagement. This meant increasing visible patrols in the historically neglected industrial sectors of the port, actively monitoring the environments where heavy alcohol consumption intersected with youth gatherings, and working diligently to build essential bridges of communication and trust with the local residents. The goal shifted from simply catching killers to actively dismantling the complex, dangerous socioeconomic ecosystems that produce them, representing a fundamental evolution in the philosophy of public safety, driven entirely by the desperate need to ensure that the horrific failures of that fateful night were never permitted to replicate themselves within the boundaries of their jurisdiction. The passage of time slowly transforms raw, bleeding tragedies into historical narratives, weaving them permanently into the cultural tapestry of the region. The story of Manutefia Kupu, once a screaming, urgent headline-dominating local news cycles, eventually settled into the collective memory of Pago Pago as a grim, defining piece of local lore. It transitioned into a somber, cautionary tale passed down from older generations to the youth, a stark warning about the lethal dangers of uncontrolled alcohol consumption, the deceptive, ruinous nature of gang affiliation, and the absolute necessity of maintaining situational awareness in the dark corners of the town. However, in this process of historical distillation, it is crucial that the core humanity of the victim is not entirely lost. Manu must not be remembered merely as a tragic catalyst for legal reform or a symbol of societal failure. He must be actively remembered as a living, breathing individual whose life possessed inherent value, whose presence brought joy to those who knew him, and whose completely senseless destruction represents an enduring, unquantifiable loss to the community that he called home. The physical location of the murder, that specific, isolated corridor hidden among the sprawling, rust-stained warehouses and the stacked shipping containers of the port, has undergone a profound, psychological metamorphosis in the minds of the local residents. It is no longer just an anonymous piece of industrial infrastructure. It has been permanently consecrated by violence, transforming into a dark, invisible monument to human suffering. Even as the physical evidence of the crime was washed away by the tropical rains and the relentless passage of time, the emotional residue of the assault continues to cling to the concrete and the dirt. People navigating the area consciously adjust their routes, instinctively avoiding the heavy shadows that once served as a camouflage for the attackers. The alleyway stands as a silent, physical testament to the absolute worst capacities of human nature, a geographic scar on the landscape of Pago Pago that constantly reminds the community of the horrific price that is ultimately paid when apathy, substance abuse, and unchecked aggression are allowed to flourish unchecked in the hidden margins of their society. To fully process the immense weight of this true crime narrative, we must look beyond the sterile, clinical mechanics of the criminal justice system and engage in a deep, uncomfortable reflection on the nature of personal accountability and collective responsibility. While the specific young men who wielded the heavy wooden sticks and drove their boots into the victim's body bear the absolute, undeniable burden of legal and moral guilt, society at large must also courageously examine the systemic conditions that cultivated their monstrous behavior. A community that permits its youth to drift into disenfranchisement, that normalizes the toxic, self-destructive culture of extreme binge drinking, and that fails to adequately illuminate and monitor its public spaces, is inherently complicit in the creation of the very environment that makes such violence possible. True justice, therefore, requires more than just locking away the perpetrators. It demands a relentless, ongoing commitment to societal evolution, a collective, fierce determination to identify, confront, and dismantle the underlying social diseases that breed despair and violence before they can claim another innocent life in the dark. Ultimately, The narrative of the Pago Pago harbor murder is a profound, heart-wrenching meditation on the fragility of human existence and the devastating, rippling consequences of a single, localized explosion of violence. It is a story that strips away the romanticized illusions of island life, forcing us to stare directly into the darkest, most terrifying capabilities of the human psyche. The loss of Manutefia Kupu is a permanent, echoing void, a life violently interrupted and a future entirely stolen by the senseless, alcohol-fueled rage of a spontaneous mob. As we close the final chapter on this agonizing case file, we are left to grapple with the heavy, enduring silence that follows the strike of the judge's gavel. We must carry the lessons of this tragedy forward, holding tight to our empathy, maintaining our vigilance, and continually striving to build communities where the profound beauty of our shared environments is fiercely protected by the unwavering compassion and the steadfast, courageous humanity of the people who inhabit them. The enduring legacy of the Manu Kupu case serves as a mirror held up to the face of the Pago Pago community, forcing an examination of the reflection that is often uncomfortable and always profound. In the years following the judicial resolution and the subsequent imprisonment of the perpetrators, the narrative of that fateful weekend night has transcended the boundaries of a simple true crime story, evolving into a foundational cautionary myth for the region. This myth does not exist to glorify the violence or to sensationalize the cruelty of the attackers. Rather, it serves as a persistent, moral anchor designed to remind the living of the fragility of peace. Whenever the conversation turns toward the topic of public safety or the health of the harbor district, the memory of Manu Kupu emerges like a ghost from the shadows, an inescapable reminder of the ultimate cost of communal negligence and the devastating potential of localized, unchecked aggression. This lingering presence has transformed the very way the town views itself, encouraging a shift from a culture of passive indifference to one of active, if sometimes weary, civic consciousness. One of the most significant, if quiet, changes that has taken hold in the aftermath is the reclamation of the nighttime environment. The harbor, which once surrendered entirely to the chaos of the shadows after sunset, has seen a gradual increase in the presence of legitimate, civilian activity. Families, laborers, and business owners have collectively pushed back against the atmosphere of fear, intentionally occupying the spaces that were once ceded to the influence of spontaneous street gangs. This reclamation is not marked by bravado or the desire for confrontation. It is a calm, persistent assertion of ownership. By simply existing in these spaces, the people of Pago Pago are dismantling the territorial claims of the youth who once sought to rule the darkness through intimidation. The streets are better lit. The visibility in previously secluded alleyways has been enhanced, and there is a pervasive, heightened sense of communal surveillance that discourages the formation of predatory packs. This shift represents the most practical form of justice for Manu Kupu, the creation of a community where such a crime could no longer be committed with the same terrifying ease. The institutional response to the tragedy has also undergone a subtle but essential evolution. The local authorities, having been fundamentally shaken by the brutality of the assault and the initial difficulty of breaking the wall of silence, have moved toward a more integrated, intelligence-led approach to community safety. The focus is no longer solely on the enforcement of laws after the commission of violence, but on the anticipation and disruption of the conditions that permit violence to thrive. This involves a deeper investment in community outreach, where officers work not just as enforcers, but as bridge builders, identifying at-risk youth and connecting them with the social and economic resources they so desperately lack. By fostering genuine relationships with the local population, the police have effectively undermined the power of the street gangs to hide behind a veil of communal protection. They have realized that the most potent tool in their arsenal against violent crime is not the handcuffs or the interrogation room, but the active, informed participation of the citizens themselves. Yet, despite these advancements, the underlying socioeconomic drivers of the tragedy remain a persistent challenge that no amount of policing can entirely erase. The economic disparity and the sense of disenfranchisement that plague the peripheral areas of the port town continue to generate the same frustrations that once fueled the rage of Manu Kupu's attackers. The challenge for the future is to ensure that these frustrations are channeled into constructive, life-affirming endeavors rather than destructive, impulsive acts of violence. This requires a sustained commitment from regional leaders to prioritize the development of educational, recreational, and vocational opportunities for young people who feel excluded from the mainstream economy. The murder of Manu Kupu stands as a stark, historical warning that failing to address these systemic issues is a gamble with the safety of the entire community, and that the price of indifference is invariably paid in human blood. The Kupu family, while they have found a degree of legal closure, continue to navigate the complex, nonlinear terrain of long-term grief. Their journey is a private testament to the reality that justice, while necessary for the functioning of a society, is an insufficient salve for the loss of a loved one. Their endurance serves as an inspiration to the community, showing that it is possible to survive the most unimaginable horrors while maintaining a sense of dignity and a commitment to ensuring that Manu's life is defined by the love he gave rather than the violence he endured. They have become quiet, steadfast advocates for peace, ensuring that the human side of the statistics is never forgotten. Their story reminds us that every true crime case involves a ripple effect of suffering that extends far beyond the victim, touching generations of family members who must learn to construct a meaningful existence in the shadow of a profound, permanent void. As we look back at the arc of this entire narrative, from the chaotic, alcohol-fueled night of the ambush to the finality of the courtroom verdicts, we are struck by the extreme vulnerability of the individual in the face of the mob. The story of Manu Kupu is, at its core, a story about the absolute necessity of preserving the individual in the face of the collective. It is a warning about what happens when human beings lose their connection to one another, when they become part of a dehumanized, aggressive swarm, and when they stop seeing the person standing in front of them as a fellow citizen with a life as complex, valuable, and fragile as their own. The tragedy is that this connection was severed so easily, through the intoxicating effects of substance abuse and the seductive, false promise of gang-related dominance. It is a cautionary tale that challenges us to constantly reaffirm our commitment to empathy, to see the humanity in each other even in the most challenging and volatile of circumstances, and to resist the urge to retreat into the comfortable, dangerous certainty of our own tribal loyalties. The case file of the Manu Kupu murder is now, in many ways, a relic of the past, a document contained within the archives of the territorial justice system. However, its contents remain startlingly relevant in the context of our modern, interconnected, and often deeply polarized society. The issues it raises, the dangers of substance abuse, the tragedy of youth alienation, the fragility of public safety, and the essential importance of community vigilance, are universal challenges that transcend the specific geography of a port town in the Pacific. We are all, to some degree, inhabitants of our own local harbors, and we all share the responsibility for the quality of the world we create in the dark. The lessons of this case are meant to be carried forward, to inform our social policies, to guide our community interactions, and to shape the moral landscape of the environments we occupy. Ultimately, the act of remembering Manu Kupu is an act of defiance against the very forces that destroyed him. It is a refusal to let his death be the final word in the story of his life. By keeping his memory alive, by talking about the circumstances of his murder with honesty and resolve, and by working to ensure that his tragedy serves as a foundation for a safer, more compassionate community, the people of Pago Pago are engaging in a long-term process of healing that is as significant as any legal judgment. They are transforming the legacy of the dark alley into a beacon of civic awareness, proving that while it is possible for the worst of humanity to be unleashed in the night, it is equally possible for the best of humanity to respond with courage, resilience, and a steadfast dedication to the protection of the innocent. As this exhaustive exploration of the case comes to its inevitable conclusion, we must leave the reader with the image of the Pago Pago harbor not as it was on that dark, violent night, but as it exists in the daily potential of its citizens. The beauty of the volcanic island is a powerful, enduring reality, but it must be matched by the strength and integrity of the people who dwell upon its slopes. The story of Manu Kupu is not one of total despair, it is a call to action. It is a reminder that the world is only as safe as we choose to make it, and that every individual holds a piece of the responsibility for the collective well-being. The shadows in the alley will always be there, but it is within our power to ensure they remain empty and that the light of our shared community remains strong enough to guide every citizen safely home through the night. In the final assessment, the Manu Kupu case is a testament to the fact that while we cannot prevent every tragedy, we can decide how we respond to the suffering they leave behind. We can choose to be indifferent, or we can choose to be vigilant. We can choose to retreat into our own silos, or we can choose to stand together as a community that values every life. The judicial system gave the victim's family the only form of justice it was capable of delivering, but true justice, the kind that heals the spirit and strengthens the social contract, is an ongoing, daily pursuit. It is the work of every citizen, every neighbor, and every friend who chooses to look out for one another, to speak up against the normalization of aggression, and to insist on a culture that respects the inherent dignity of all people. Manu's life was an integral part of that culture, and his memory will forever stand as a silent, powerful demand for a future where such a loss is unimaginable. This narrative is not the end of the story, but merely a reflection on the progress made and the work that remains. It is a call to keep the flame of memory alive, not in a way that haunts or paralyzes, but in a way that enlightens and guides. It is a request for all of us to consider the harbor towns in our own lives, to recognize the risks that are often ignored, and to proactively foster the environments of safety and inclusion that are the only true protection against the darkness. The case of Manudifia Kupu will always be a heavy, painful weight in the history of Pago Pago, but it is also a source of enduring, hard-won wisdom. It is a story of a man who is lost to the worst of us, but who left behind a legacy that has the potential to bring out the best in us, provided we are willing to listen to the lessons his memory continues to teach with such quiet, persistent force. As the sun sets over the harbor one final time in this telling, casting long, familiar shadows across the industrial landscape, we are reminded that the night will always come and the darkness will always gather. But the power to define what happens within that darkness rests solely with the community. We are the architects of our own security, the keepers of our own shared morality, and the guardians of the peace that Manu Kupu was denied. May his memory continue to serve as a constant, gentle pressure on the conscience of the town, ensuring that the light of progress never fades, that the lessons of the past are never buried, and that every citizen is treated with the profound respect and protection they deserve, both in the brilliance of the day and in the deepest, most challenging reaches of the night. The reflection on the case of Manudifia Manu Kupu inevitably leads one to contemplate the broader, existential questions regarding the nature of human evil and the resilience of the communities that must survive in its wake. When we strip away the legal terminology, the forensic evidence, and the grim statistics of the violent assault, we are left with the raw, pulsating reality of a life extinguished in its prime, a man whose existence was woven into the vibrant, salty air of Pago Pago, only to be violently severed by the incomprehensible cruelty of his own peers. This narrative arc, beginning with the tranquil promise of a weekend night and concluding with the cold, sterile finality of a prison sentence, is a cycle that repeats itself in harbor towns across the globe, a recurring tragedy that exposes the precariousness of modern civilization. The finality of the courtroom proceedings acts as a necessary societal suture, a way to close the physical wound of the crime, yet the psychological scar remains, pulsating with the memory of the violence that once occupied that hidden, industrial corner of the harbor. We must grapple with the fact that evil, in its most mundane and spontaneous form, does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives in the quiet, shadowed margins of our lives, fueled by the toxic convergence of substances, frustration, and the loss of individual conscience. If we are to draw a meaningful conclusion from the life and death of Manu Kupu, we must resist the urge to relegate his story to the archives of forgotten history. His memory is a living, breathing entity that challenges the status quo of our communal existence. It asks us, with an intensity that cannot be ignored, whether we are truly doing enough to protect the vulnerable among us from the predatory instincts that can manifest so suddenly within our own neighborhoods. The case serves as an enduring reminder that the health of a society is not measured by its economic output or the grandeur of its infrastructure, but by the safety and dignity of the most ordinary citizen walking the streets at the most vulnerable hours. When we allow the nighttime to become a lawless vacuum, when we ignore the warning signs of youth alienation and the rampant, normalized culture of substance abuse, we are not just witnessing a decline in social standards. We are actively constructing the environments where tragedies like this become inevitable. The responsibility is not merely that of the law enforcement officer or the judge. It is the shared burden of every neighbor, friend, and observer who has the power to speak out, to intervene, and to demand a higher standard of communal care. The evolution of Pago Pago since that fateful night is a testament to the fact that even the most profound darkness can eventually give way to a cautious, determined light. The community has, in its own way, begun the long, arduous process of reclaiming its identity from the grip of the violence that once defined it. By choosing to occupy public spaces, by fostering transparency in local governance, and by building the essential social bridges that prevent the isolation of at-risk individuals, the town has engaged in a form of active, preventative justice. It is a slow, often frustrating process, marked by setbacks and the persistent echoes of past trauma, yet it is a necessary endeavor. We must recognize that the prevention of such crimes requires a fundamental, structural change in how we relate to one another, a shift toward a culture of radical empathy that sees the potential for both the highest good and the lowest evil in every human interaction. We are the guardians of our own social peace, and we must remain vigilant, recognizing that the safety of our harbors is a continuous, collective negotiation rather than a static, guaranteed state of being. Furthermore, we must address the difficult, uncomfortable topic of what happens to the perpetrators long after the news cycle has moved on and the courtroom lights have dimmed. The prison system is, by its very design, an environment of isolation and rigid confinement, yet it remains an essential component of the justice that was promised to the family of the victim. However, we must also consider whether the punitive nature of the system provides the opportunity for any form of genuine, internal reconciliation, or if it merely hardens the hearts of those who have already committed such profound atrocities. For the ringleader and his accomplices, their future is a stagnant, repetitive cycle of regret and confinement, a living reminder of the weight of their choices. Their existence behind bars serves as a grim marker of the irreversible consequence of their actions, a cautionary exhibit that underscores the fact that once the boundary of lethal violence is crossed, there is no path back to the person they once were or the future they once anticipated. Their lives, much like Manu's, have been permanently shattered, demonstrating that the destructive force of their actions ultimately consumed them as well. The story of the Manu Kupu case is therefore not just about a single murder, but about the profound, rippling impact of one individual's presence and the catastrophic silence left in their absence. We must honor him by refusing to let his story be reduced to a footnote in a true crime series, ensuring instead that it remains a catalyst for genuine, systemic improvement. This means looking at our own lives, our own towns, and our own harbors, and asking whether we are fostering environments that nurture the human spirit or environments that allow it to wither in the shadows. We must prioritize the development of mentorship for our youth, providing them with a sense of belonging and purpose that prevents the temptation of destructive tribalism. We must challenge the normalization of alcohol as a means of emotional escape, fostering instead a culture where mental health and emotional well-being are supported by a strong, interconnected social fabric. These are the practical, daily actions that constitute true, long-term justice for the victims of senseless violence. As we bring this extended narrative to a close, we find ourselves standing once more at the edge of the Pago Pago harbor, watching the tide as it moves with the same relentless, rhythmic persistence it had on the night Manu Kupu was taken from us. The water reflects the stars, the distant lights of the port flicker with industrial efficiency, and the air remains heavy with the scent of the ocean and the promise of a new day. The past is a weight we carry, an indelible part of the landscape, Yet we must choose to move forward with the wisdom it has bestowed upon us. We have peered into the darkest corners of human behavior and survived, and in doing so, we have gained a deeper, more profound understanding of the sanctity of human life and the critical importance of protecting it against all odds. May the memory of Manu Kupu be a guiding, protective force for the community, a steady, unwavering light that ensures no other life is ever again extinguished in the dark, and that the harbor remains, always, a place of arrival, of life, and of peace for every soul that calls it home. The lessons we have gathered here about the fragility of our social contracts, the insidious nature of alcohol-driven aggression, the importance of communal vigilance, and the absolute necessity of fostering empathy are not merely theoretical. They are the bedrock upon which a safer future must be built. Each of us, in our own way, holds the potential to be a force for good in the lives of those around us, to be the eyes that watch, the hands that help, and the voices that insist upon a world defined by mutual respect and safety. When we walk through the shadows of our own lives, we can carry the lessons of this case as a lantern, an awareness that helps us navigate the complexities of our environments with care and intention. We are not defined by the violence that may occur within our sight, but by our refusal to let that violence dictate our future. We are defined by our resilience, by our capacity to mourn, and by our persistent, unwavering demand for a world where justice is not just a verdict, but a way of life. Let us commit to this pursuit with the same tenacity that the investigators showed in their pursuit of the truth, and the same resilience that the family of the victim showed in the face of their agonizing loss. Let us look toward the horizon of our shared existence with a sense of purpose, knowing that every act of kindness, every moment of genuine connection, and every gesture of communal support serves as a wall against the encroachment of the darkness. The case of Manudifia Kupu is a closed file, but the work it inspired is eternal. It is a work of building, of healing, and of protecting that which is most precious, our connection to one another and our commitment to a common, shared humanity. As we step away from this story, let us do so with a renewed sense of responsibility, fully aware that the quiet, everyday choices we make are the final, strongest barriers against the chaos, and that together, we have the power to create a world that is fundamentally, irrevocably safer for all. Ultimately, we are left with the silence of the harbor, a silence that is no longer oppressive, but reflective. It is a silence that speaks of the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption through remembrance. Manu Kupu lives on not in the cold records of the courthouse, but in the heightened awareness of the people who inhabit his hometown. He lives on in the better-lit streets, in the more engaged local outreach, and in the increased sense of communal solidarity that has emerged from the rubble of his tragedy. His life has become a permanent, integral part of the narrative of Pago Pago, a foundational layer of its collective consciousness that demands, with a quiet, persistent force, that we never again allow the darkness to take what is ours. We are the stewards of this legacy, the guardians of this memory, and as we look out over the vast, calm waters of the Pacific, we do so with the profound knowledge that we are stronger, more aware, and more committed to one another than we have ever been before. This, then, is the conclusion of our journey into the heart of the Pago Pago Harbor, a journey that has challenged our understanding of crime, punishment, and the enduring resilience of the human soul. We have navigated the complexities of a brutal, senseless act and emerged with a deeper appreciation for the light we must protect. May this reflection serve as a permanent tribute to Manudifia Manu Kupu, an ordinary man who deserves to be remembered for the entirety of his life, not just for the devastating tragedy of his end. May his story continue to inspire, to educate, and to serve as a beacon for all of us as we work to build a future defined by peace, understanding, and the steadfast, unwavering protection of the innocent in every corner of our shared world. The harbor lights remain a steady, guiding presence against the encroaching night, a symbol of our collective resolve to ensure that, no matter the challenges we face, we will always, together, find our way home. The final chapter of this narrative is not merely a summary, but a profound meditation on the enduring resonance of a tragedy that refused to fade into the background of Pago Pago's history. As we survey the evolution of the region in the decade since the murder of Manudifia Kupu, we see a community that has matured in its understanding of the delicate balance between industrial prosperity and the fundamental requirement for civic safety. The harbor, once a place that could harbor secrets in its deepest industrial pockets, has transformed into a living, breathing testament to the power of collective memory. Every time the community gathers for local events, or whenever the youth programs initiate new mentorship cycles, there is an unspoken, underlying recognition of the cost that was once paid. This is not a culture of trauma, but a culture of awareness, an understanding that the peace of their island home is a living entity that requires constant nurturing, vigilance, and a shared commitment to the principles of mutual respect and social cohesion. The story of Manu Kupu has become a pillar of this new civic identity, an anchor that keeps the community grounded even when the challenges of the modern world threaten to pull them adrift into the same currents of frustration and alienation that once claimed his life. We must consider the philosophical implications of such a crime in a world that is becoming increasingly interconnected, where the local is no longer shielded from the global. The pressures that fueled the spontaneous violence in that hidden alleyway, the search for identity in a changing economy, the destructive escapism offered by substance abuse, and the fragile nature of social belonging, are the same pressures felt by young people in urban centers and isolated communities alike. The Pago Pago experience, therefore, serves as a universal archetype for the struggle to maintain human dignity in the face of structural decay. It teaches us that the solutions to such problems cannot be top-down, nor can they be exclusively punitive. They must be rooted in the soil of the local experience, built on the authentic relationships between neighbors, mentors, and the youth who are searching for their place in the world. The shift in Pago Pago toward proactive, community-integrated safety strategies is a blueprint that demonstrates how a town can turn its greatest sorrow into a foundational strength, creating a net of social support so tightly woven that no individual is ever allowed to slip into the isolating darkness of predatory behavior. Moreover, the process of healing for the Kupu family continues to unfold as a silent, powerful counterpoint to the noise of the original trial. Their grace in the face of such profound, senseless loss has provided a moral compass for the entire community. They have shown that while the legal system is a necessary component of justice, it is the resilience of the human heart that defines the true trajectory of recovery. By choosing to honor Manu's memory through advocacy for peace and education, they have effectively transformed his legacy from that of a victim of brutal violence into a symbol of enduring community hope. This shift is the most profound victory over the perpetrators. The men who acted in the dark intended to erase Manu, to exert dominance over his existence and discard him as though his life held no inherent value. Instead, through the actions of his loved ones and the collective memory of his fellow citizens, his life has been amplified, becoming a permanent, constructive force that continues to shape the conscience of the town long after the prison cells have closed. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the Pago Pago harbor must be carried forward by a new generation that did not witness the immediate horror, but who are the beneficiaries of the safer, more aware community that rose from the ashes. This generation carries the torch of memory, tasked with ensuring that the complacency of the past does not return to weaken the foundations of their shared security. They must be taught that vigilance is not the same as paranoia, and that compassion is not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate expression of civic strength. They must learn to recognize the subtle warning signs of social unraveling, the isolation of their peers, the normalization of aggressive language, and the unchecked spread of intoxicating substances, and have the courage to intervene before those threads snap. The memory of Manu Kupu is a lantern that they must hold aloft, illuminating the dark corners that were once allowed to go unchecked, ensuring that no shadow is ever again deep enough to hide the potential for such catastrophic loss. The role of the media and the chroniclers of history in this process cannot be overstated. By telling this story with empathy, precision, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, we serve as the keepers of the collective conscience. We ensure that the details of the case, as painful as they may be, remain part of the public discourse, acting as a prophylactic against the natural tendency to forget or to trivialize the past. This narrative is not designed to entertain or to satisfy a morbid curiosity. It is a serious, scholarly, and deeply human examination of a structural failure that resulted in an irredeemable loss. It serves as a reminder that every true crime case, at its heart, is a failure of our ability to see and support one another. By articulating these failures clearly, we provide the raw material from which a stronger, more conscientious society can be built. We move from the singular, tragic incident to the universal, constructive lesson, ensuring that the death of one man continues to protect the lives of many others. In reflecting on the nature of justice, we must also acknowledge that the restorative process is never truly complete. There are always those who are touched by the tragedy whose voices remain unheard, whose pain remains unexpressed, and whose understanding of the events is obscured by time and personal trauma. For them, the narrative of the case serves as a point of reconnection, a way to place their own experiences within a broader, meaningful context. It allows them to see that their suffering is not isolated, but part of a shared, community-wide experience that has been recognized and honored. The collective act of remembering is a form of communal therapy, a way to process the weight of the past so that it does not prevent the forward motion of the future. It is a testament to the fact that, even in the face of the most agonizing, incomprehensible events, a community can find the strength to remain unified, compassionate, and steadfast in its commitment to the dignity of every individual life. The geographic beauty of Pago Pago, with its volcanic majesty and its deep, sheltering waters, is not a backdrop, but a silent witness to the resilience of its people. The island itself, with its rhythms dictated by the Pacific tides, reminds us that life is cyclical and that even after the most devastating storms, the natural order seeks restoration. The community has embraced this spirit, choosing to grow around the scar of the murder rather than letting it define their existence. They have allowed the tragedy to become a part of their identity, much like the weathered volcanic rock that defines their coastline, hardened, shaped, and strengthened by the relentless pressure of the elements. This is the ultimate triumph of the human spirit, the capacity to endure, to learn, and to ultimately transcend the limitations imposed by the darkest moments of our collective experience. We must also extend our contemplation to the idea that the harbor is a metaphor for the spaces we occupy within each other's lives. We are all, in our own way, ports of arrival and departure, holding space for the journeys of those we encounter. The tragic loss of Manu Kupu reminds us that we are responsible for the atmosphere of the ports we create. Are they welcoming, safe, and nurturing? Do they provide the light that is necessary for our neighbors to navigate their own dark stretches of the night? Or are they places of neglect, where the shadows are allowed to grow and the spirits of others are left to wander in isolation? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves, regardless of our geography. The Pago Pago experience is a call to be more conscious, more active, and more compassionate architects of our own social environments, knowing that the quality of the space we create is the ultimate defense against the emergence of the darkness. As we bring this entire project to its final conclusion, the memory of Manidafia Kupu remains etched into the fabric of the community, like the inscription on a monument. He is a part of the history, a part of the lessons, and a part of the hope that sustains the town. He is the reason why the lights stay on, why the neighbors look out for one another, and why the youth of today are given the support that the youth of yesterday so desperately lacked. His story is a closed file in the eyes of the law, but it is an open book in the hearts of the people who walk the streets of Pago Pago. It is a story of a life that mattered, a death that sparked change, and a community that, in the face of its own worst failures, found the courage to reclaim its humanity and build a future that is worthy of the memory of every life it has ever lost. The harbor remains, the tide continues its rhythm, and the people, stronger and more united, continue their journey, forever carrying the lantern of Manu's legacy to ensure that the night is always and forever kept at bay. In the final, quiet moments of reflection, we can see the image of Manu Kupu not in the agony of his final hour, but in the vibrant, everyday potential of the community he belonged to. We see him in the laughter of children playing by the docks, in the focused effort of the local workers, and in the quiet, steady dedication of the neighbors who work to ensure that their home remains a sanctuary. He is the silent, protective presence that encourages the town to keep moving, keep growing, and keep looking out for one another. His death was a tragedy of immense, unforgivable proportions, but his legacy is one of enduring, transformative strength. And so, the story of Pago Pago Harbor concludes not with a sense of finality, but with a renewed, unshakable sense of purpose. The harbor lights shine bright, guiding the way, ensuring that every person who enters this space, regardless of the time or the darkness of the night, is met with the warmth, the protection, and the profound, shared humanity of a community that knows the true value of every soul and that is pledged, with all its heart, to never again allow the shadows to dim the light of their shared existence. The memory of Manu is the guardian of this pledge, and as long as the people of Pago Pago continue to look out for each other, he will always be there, a part of the community he loved, standing watch in the light, forever safe, forever remembered, and forever a beacon for all who seek the way home. The echoes of the Manu Kupu case continue to reverberate through the consciousness of Pago Pago, serving as a permanent, albeit haunting, waypoint in the town's ongoing sociological development. To look back at the conclusion of this investigation is to acknowledge that justice, in its formal and legal capacity, is but a fleeting moment, a snapshot of accountability that rarely captures the full, sprawling complexity of the vacuum left by a life stolen. The true resolution does not exist in the sentencing transcripts or the dusty archives of the territorial court. It resides in the collective, persistent behavior of a community that has collectively decided that its identity will no longer be compromised by the shadows that once defined its nocturnal borders. By refusing to let the tragedy be a static event, the people of the harbor have engaged in a dynamic, lifelong process of social reparation, ensuring that the environment which once permitted such unmitigated savagery is gradually reshaped into a space where human life is treated with a profound, non-negotiable sanctity. This transformation is the most significant byproduct of the tragedy, acting as a living, evolving testament to a town that found its moral center in the aftermath of its greatest collapse. We must also recognize the importance of storytelling as a primary tool for community preservation and preventative education. The act of recounting the Manu Kupu story is not a process of dredging up pain for the sake of sensation. It is a vital, pedagogical exercise. By maintaining a clear, unwavering narrative of what occurred, the community immunizes itself against the dangers of selective amnesia or the romanticization of the past. It keeps the details of the incident fresh enough to serve as a constant warning, ensuring that the next generation of youth understands that their actions carry terminal consequences and that their choices, no matter how small they may seem in the heat of a drunken night, are part of a wider, consequential history. This ongoing conversation acts as a social firewall, preventing the toxic conditions of the past from being replicated in the future. It is a commitment to truth, even when that truth is agonizing, because the community understands that the only way to safeguard its children is to be entirely transparent about the darkness that has already touched their streets. The role of local leadership, including community organizers, educators, and mentors, has undergone a fundamental shift toward a more holistic view of public safety. There is a tangible realization that the harbor's strength is not derived from its cranes or its shipping capacity, but from the resilience and cohesion of its social fabric. The programs implemented in the wake of the murder, those designed to provide structured outlets for youthful energy and to address the underlying drivers of local alienation, are the true, enduring solutions to the problem of spontaneous violence. By providing a clear, alternative pathway for young men who might otherwise have been seduced by the false, destructive promises of territorial gang dominance, the community is proactively eroding the foundations of the next potential tragedy. This is a quiet, unsung work, often occurring without fanfare in community centers and school halls, yet it is the bedrock upon which a sustainable, secure future is built. It is an affirmation that when we invest in the human spirit, We create a stronger defense against the intrusion of violence than any amount of police surveillance or increased lighting could ever hope to provide. Furthermore, we must address the enduring, quiet suffering of those who were collateral casualties of the crime, those whose lives were irrevocably altered by the loss of Manu Kupu. For the family, for the friends, and for the local residents who happened upon the scene, the murder is not a chapter that can be closed. It is a permanent condition of their reality. Their ability to persevere, to seek meaning in the absence of justice, and to emerge as advocates for the very community that failed to protect their loved one is an extraordinary demonstration of human resilience. They are the true architects of the harbor's new moral landscape, for they have chosen to transmute their personal suffering into a public good. Their influence, though often subtle, acts as an invisible, grounding force that keeps the town focused on the essential, protecting the humanity of the individual against the crushing weight of the mob. They remind us that the cost of such crimes is not just the loss of one life, but the fracturing of a lineage, a history, and a future that can never be fully restored to its original state. As we consider the broader impact of this true crime narrative, we are reminded of the profound power of empathy as a social imperative. Empathy is not a passive emotion. It is an active, rigorous discipline that requires us to imagine the life, the dreams, and the dignity of the person standing across from us, even when our environments, our histories, and our circumstances are vastly different. The attackers in the alleyway had entirely abandoned this discipline, choosing instead to objectify their victim, to strip him of his personhood, and to reduce him to a target for their collective rage. The challenge for Pago Pago, and for every other community that seeks to avoid such fates, is to embed the practice of empathy into the very architecture of their civic life. We must teach ourselves to see the humanity in the stranger, to recognize the pain in the isolated, and to act with a collective compassion that prevents the fragmentation of the social body. When empathy becomes the governing principle of a community, the conditions necessary for predatory, pack-style violence are systematically dismantled, as the individual is no longer an object, but a valued member of the whole. The question of whether or not we can ever truly solve the problem of human violence is, perhaps, the wrong query entirely. Violence, in its many unpredictable forms, will always be a possibility in the human experience. The true test of a community is not the absence of violence, but the quality of its response. In Pago Pago, the response to the Manu Kupu case was a grueling, protracted effort to acknowledge, to grieve, to seek accountability, and to ultimately grow. This growth is the victory. It is the proof that even when a community is torn asunder by an incomprehensible act of brutality, it can hold itself together long enough to forge a new, stronger path forward. This resilience is the ultimate, defiant rebuttal to the darkness. It is the realization that while we cannot always control the actions of the worst among us, we can exert total control over the values, the structures, and the commitments that define our shared existence. We must also reflect on the role of the environment itself as a witness. The volcanic ridges and the deep waters of the Pago Pago harbor remain, indifferent and eternal, watching over the town as it grapples with its own humanity. They have seen centuries of change, from the arrival of the first navigators to the industrial development of the modern era, and they will see centuries more. The murder of Manu Kupu, for all its immense, screaming horror, is but a fleeting moment in the geological time of the island. Yet, within that moment, the human drama was played out in its most extreme and agonizing form. The lesson for the community is to ensure that their stewardship of this place matches its beauty and its permanence. They are not just inhabitants of an island. They are the guardians of a history, and their responsibility is to ensure that this history is not defined by the violence that occurred in a dark corner, but by the relentless, enduring effort to build a life worth living on the slopes of their volcanic home. As we reach the true end of this exhaustive account, the image that remains is one of steady, focused continuity. The port is alive with the hum of industry. The streets are filled with the life of a community that has chosen, despite everything, to continue their journey together. The memory of Manudafia Kupu is not a weight that drags the town down. It is a quiet, steadying hand that keeps them on their path. He is remembered not in the darkness, but in the light of the morning sun hitting the water, the light of the lamps that now illuminate the once hidden paths, and the light of the shared, human warmth that the citizens now extend to one another with a newfound, deliberate intensity. This is the ultimate, final resolution. It is the commitment of a town to be better, to be kinder, and to be more protective of the life that has been entrusted to its care. This narrative has traversed the depths of human cruelty and the heights of communal resilience, providing a comprehensive, unflinching look at a case that changed the very heart of the harbor. We have documented the tragedy, the investigation, the legal battle, and the agonizing, ongoing aftermath, leaving no stone unturned in our attempt to understand the mechanisms of the loss and the potential for a collective, meaningful recovery. The story of Manu Kupu is now part of the permanent, cultural consciousness of the Pacific, a somber, protective beacon that will continue to cast its influence forward through the years to come. May it remain a powerful, enduring lesson for everyone who hears it, a story that demands our vigilance, calls upon our compassion, and inspires our unwavering commitment to a world where every life is held with the deepest, most reverent regard, and where the light of our shared humanity is never, ever allowed to fail. The final word, then, belongs not to the crime, but to the recovery. It belongs to the mother who keeps her son's name alive, to the mentor who guides a troubled boy away from the shadows, to the officer who chooses connection over force, and to every single citizen who walks their streets with an awareness of the value of their neighbor. It belongs to the harbor itself, which remains a place of life, a gateway to the world, and a home to those who have learned, through the hardest of lessons, exactly what it means to be a community. As the dusk settles over Pago Pago one last time, the lights flicker on one by one, a growing, brilliant constellation against the encroaching night. This is the town of today, transformed by its past, yet looking firmly toward the horizon, moving forward with the wisdom of the ages and the fierce, protective love of a people who have finally, truly understood the price of their peace and who are resolved, with every beat of their shared heart, to ensure that it is never again lost to the shadows.